Hello again, everyone. My name is David Saunders. I'm Associate Curator here in the Antiquities Department at the Getty Villa and co-curator of our exhibition Picture Worlds, Greek, Maya, and Moche Pottery, which is the basis for today's event. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you here, both in person and for all those of you out watching on Zoom. Thank you very much. We know you have many options on a Sunday afternoon, so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us for today's event. Before starting this afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge that the land that the Getty inhabits today was once known as Tovangar, the name of the Gabrielino Tongva people. We show our respects to the Gabrielino Tongva people as well as all First People, past, present, and future, and honor their labor as original caretakers of this land. The Getty commits to building relationships with the Gabrielino Tongva community, and we invite you to acknowledge the history of this land and join us in caring for it. Today's event springs from our exhibition, which I hope you have all had the opportunity to see, the exhibition Picture Worlds, Greek, Maya, and Moche Pottery on our second floor exhibition galleries. This exhibition brings together the painted pottery of three distinct and unrelated societies. The Greeks in the Mediterranean between around 700 and 323 BCE, the Maya in Central America focusing on between around 550 and 850 CE, and the Moche people or peoples in northern Peru between around 200 and 850 CE. And I show you this map here to make very clear. These are cultures that are scattered across the globe, flourishing at different time periods with no evidence of contact or trade amongst one another. They have very different social structures, different religious beliefs, ritual practices, very little in common in many senses, but all three of them have produced and have left behind this incredible body of painted pottery, and not simply pottery painted, but decorated with rich and complex scenes of narrative imagery, representations of divinities, of heroes, of legendary events and ritual activities. And this has been the sort of focus of our exhibition in thinking about what these pots do within these cultures, the ways in which their painted scenes can bring these stories to life, that they both preserve and animate and perpetuate these narratives that are passed down across generation and through communities. And if you've had a chance to see the exhibition, the second gallery, the core of the show, called Stories and Images, focuses on this theme, and particularly the central case, which we've titled Narrative Moments. And looking more closely at the three vessels in this case, even if you don't know the scenes that are being depicted here, and you will learn more about each of these vessels as the afternoon progresses, you can see that there are things going on. There are people moving about, there is action, fighting, individuals shooting blowguns. These are episodes of narrative event and activity, and each of these presupposes a network of stories, episodes that lead up to each of these moments, and likewise the aftermath and the consequences of each of the events that you see here. And so each of these pots, as I say, is an invitation to tell stories, to digress, to wax lyrical, and I suppose at risk of doing that myself, I'm going to cut myself short, but just to kind of sow the seed for what we are doing today, and wanting to explore these three narrative traditions in more detail, and then to go deeper, step back, look ahead to contemporary imagery, thinking about the ways in which we understand these images today, strategies for deciphering these images, and the roles in which painted stories still play a fundamental part in how we as contemporary society talk to one another and the stories that we tell and continue to relate. So that is, the soil out of which today, the plant of today has grown. I am going to hand over straight away to our first speaker, who I am delighted to welcome, my colleague Mark Stansbury O'Donnell, who is Professor of Archaeology and Art History at the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota. Mark.
So, can you hear me well? Great. Thank you, David, for the introduction, and also thank you for the invitation to be part of this project. It's been very refreshing and reinvigorating for me. I've been looking at Greek pottery for so long. To come with fresh eyes to Moshe and Mayan pottery and relearn kind of what I've been thinking about Greek pottery has been a great experience. And also, Ula, Stephen, and I went through the galleries with David earlier, and it was really just great to talk about each of our pots with the others, and I've learned an awful lot from that. And so hopefully we can pass that on to you. Great. Before I get into the first slide, just want to sketch 4 points that I'd like you to keep in mind, because I'm going to be less about telling stories and thinking about narration itself, especially for Greek pottery. And one is which is narrative is about a story or an action, but it presupposes not just that, but there's a sender and a receiver. There's a narrator and there's the recipient of the narrative. And if a tree falls in the forest, I think it does make a sound, but it doesn't tell a story if nobody hears it. And I think focusing on the consumer, the receiver, is important for what I want to look at today. And then that presupposes a second point about visual language. There has to be a common visual language. We think of spoken language, but when you recognize a figure, you may not be of the same culture, but you apply your own name to it. You begin your own set of interpretations. But there has to be that kind of common link, otherwise narration won't take place. Third point is, we tend to think of myth as being kind of whole and complete. Greek myth, Roman myth, whatever, but in fact it's a lot more messy than that. The Greeks borrowed a lot of myths from other cultures and blended them with their own. Other cultures borrowed Greek myths, and so there's a kind of common ground of mythology in the Mediterranean to draw on. And then fourth, about narration, we usually think of a poet like Homer going and reciting the Iliad and people listening to it. So that's how one-way narration can be transmitted. But with the case of pots, pots are really portable. Unlike paintings or sculptures, pots are portable. And so in a way, it's the narrative that's moving rather than the sender of the narrative, as it would be with Homer. And so that's why I want to focus on the pot and the viewer in most of what I'm going to talk about. So to get to the pictures, the interesting thing about Greek art is after the fall of the Bronze Age palaces, there was not much figural imagery. You can count basically on 2 hands the number of figural images. So the visual language that they had in the Bronze Age essentially collapsed. But in the 8th century, we begin to see pots like this, which is in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and they began to paint images on the pots again. Now you can see the images are really rudimentary, and even I, who can't draw, can imitate what they're doing here. But they read clearly. We have a ship battle. We have warriors marching. Up at the top, we have a funeral couch with the deceased, and then mourners underneath. And all of these are things that we find in epic poetry, like the Iliad, the themes just generally. These are not specific themes, but they're themes that were important to the aristocratic elite, and it was their patronage that stimulated the production of these vessels. This vessel is over 3 feet high and was one of a number that were put into cemeteries, and it was a way for the aristocratic elite to signal their social status and their importance, not just through the size of the pot, but by the reinvention of narrative images. So we have a sender, the artist, working with a patron to create an image that then the viewer, the visitor to the cemetery, would see. So narration is taking place, but it's pretty basic. In the 7th century, things get better because potters and painters learn to do better. They invent new techniques for painting, and so they can introduce much more detail to the picture. So this plate, which is in the exhibition, shows Hector and Menelaus fighting over the corpse of Euphorbus, and so it's called the Euphorbus plate. We see much more detailed warriors, we see details of their armor, we see their actions much more clearly. But it's still kind of just a basic fighting scene over a body, but the added detail of the inscriptions, which again, writing is new. Writing didn't exist at the time of the other pot. The writing here helps a reader to identify who the figures are, Hector and Menelaus fighting. So that helps make the narrative more specific and less generic, and that's kind of the point. If you want a strong narrative, you need to know about the characters, you need to know about a specific action, and so inscriptions are one way. But most people aren't literate, and to be candid, if we switched the names, I don't think it would really make much of a difference in terms of the visual story here. But it's important. But I think better strategies are required, especially if you can't read Greek. Even more productive for narrative was what was happening in Corinth during the 7th century, where the Corinthian potters invented black figure paintings. You paint the silhouette, and then you scratch through with the stylus the details of the figure, and then you do added color to it. And with that, you can see much more detailed figures, much variety of creatures. You can even see narratives, as you see on the right, a battle taking place and riders racing. Thing about these vessels and why I put the dimensions on, they're this big. They're perfume containers. And the Corinthian black figure was invented basically to go on these perfume containers. And one theory is that it became kind of a brand recognition. You know, this was a unique style, very clearly identified. And so if you had a little bottle like this, it told you that there was Corinthian perfume in it. And that's what Corinth was actually known for, the perfume. So the style helps to support the perfume. But Corinthian potters really didn't have much interest in narrative. And this is where Athens comes in, and that's what I'll be talking about for the rest of the day. Athenian pottery in the 7th century, until the end of it, wasn't very much, or wasn't very remarkable. Some unusual objects, but not very much. But in the late 7th century, they stole black figure technique from the Corinthians. And so that's what we see on this pot here. But instead of perfume containers, they're putting it on pottery that's more used for the serving of wine and consumption of food. So here we have a wine pitcher, and on it we can see Hermes, and we can recognize Hermes because of his caduceus. So this is what they made, and what's interesting about this vessel is it was found in Nola. And Nola is a city that had Italic peoples, the Oscans, the Samnites, the Etruscans, and there were also Greeks. It's near Naples. And this is the thing that begins to distinguish Athenian pottery. Athenian pottery has narrative stories, and that's what they offered to the consumer in the Mediterranean. And what we find in the 6th century is that they're exporting a great number of these vessels and selling them. So what did they use them for? This is a plate from Sir William Hamilton's publication of his vases. After the discovery of Pompeii, they began finding tombs with vases and amassed huge collections of them. That's kind of the basis of the collections in the Louvre and the British Museum today. But as you can see here, there's a tomb, a body in the tomb, and vases have been placed around the tomb. And this is a tomb in Nola. We don't know who was buried there. It's just a generic illustration. But it shows the use of the pots into the graves, which is good because that helps to preserve them. Further north in Italy, in Etruria, they had chamber tombs, and they would lay the body on a shelf, and they would put vases inside the tomb or inside the antechamber. And sometimes they would open up the tomb over several generations and add vases to it. But these are part of the assemblage, the grave goods that were left with the deceased for the afterlife. So, knowing that this is what the vases were being used for and where they were going, how did the potters and the painters respond to that market? Because what I want to maintain is that this isn't just an Athenian artist telling a story for themselves. They're aware of where their pots are going. And so this is a vase, a neck amphora. And what's interesting about this is it comes from the Nicosthenic workshop. And it's a very distinct shape with the strap handles, the grooves on the side. Now, in terms of subject, it's quite interesting because it's got a Dionysiac scene. So you have Dionysus on a mule, you have satyrs and maenads, all things related to wine, and that's obviously a good thing to have as a decoration. Everybody likes wine. But what's interesting about the vessel is that it's an imitation of an Etruscan shape, a Bucero-ware amphora, and these were earlier. And so the Athenian potters get examples of these, they make imitations of the shape, and then they put black figure decoration on them with narrative scenes. And then they send them back to Etruria, so kind of like coals to Newcastle, so to speak. But this, I think, demonstrates that they're aware not just of stories for their audience, for their market, but also the interest in shapes, and that they're responding to consumer demand. A few other examples of this. This is called a bio cup for banded decoration inside and outside. Not a lot of these were made, but they're very large and very distinct. And a colleague of mine, Professor Athena Tsingarita, mapped them out. And what's interesting about the find spots, as you can see from this map, is they're all over the Mediterranean. 2 of 14 were found in Athens, but others were found elsewhere: Italy, Sicily, Egypt, and East Greece in present-day Turkey. So this really shows that the vases that they're making have an export audience in mind. And in fact, 75% of Athenian vases are found outside of Athens and Attica. A second example that a colleague, Tara Trehi, published was looking at this motif of a woman riding a bull, which is likely to be Europa. She noticed a number of these in black figure and mapped them out using a different kind of program. But as you can see, they start in Athens, and then they spread again to Italy, Sicily, and 3 down to Rhodes. What's more interesting about her work is that she also mapped the trademarks. The merchants put their mark on the bottoms of some of these spaces to track their inventory. And so she can link certain of these merchants with this collection of vases, with the workshops. And that's the feedback loop that I'd like to maintain happen. Painters are painting for a non-Greek audience outside of Greece, but how do they know what the people outside of Greece like or don't like? Well, it's the merchants who provide that feedback. If a merchant sells something, that will come back. If a merchant doesn't sell something and has to remainder it for 50% at the end of the journey, then that's going to come back and they won't make more of that. But I think that's an important dynamic going on here. Finally, one last example. These oversized drinking cups, that is more than 35 centimeters in diameter. And if you go up to the exhibition, they have a mock-up they have a model of one of these kailikes up there. That's smaller than these, and the one up there is pretty large. There aren't too many of these, and they're very monumental, but they provided a monumental picture space, and they were probably placed on the floor and looked at. So Professor Tsingarita mapped those out, and they're all in Etruria or in Etruscan Nola, except for one on the Acropolis in Athens, and that was probably a votive offering from a potter or painter, she suspects. So completely an export item. So they are exporting their pottery, they're exporting their narratives. So how do you make the narration take place so that the viewer recognizes the narrative? And I think this vase illustrates that quite well. It's probably a scene that you can recognize. It's Heracles and the Nemean lion. He's wrestling the lion. But if you think about it, if I were going to confront a lion, I would go with weapons. And most lion hunts have weapons. This combination of actions is unique. He's wrestling a lion. Who does that? Well, Heracles does that, and he has to do it with the Nemean lion because weapons don't work against the skin of the Nemean lion. So what painters need to do is they have all these narrative moments that they can pick, and they need to pick a moment that is unusual, even unique, so that the viewer can eliminate other possibilities and then zero in on the story. Because as David mentioned earlier, there are many moments, but a picture doesn't have much variation in time within it. You need multiple pictures for that, like the comic books. So choosing this narrative unique moment lets the viewer move on. Now, universal themes are also good. This is a drinking cup, and we see two warriors fighting over another warrior who's falling down onto his knee, kind of like the Euphorbus plate. Still no labels here. So warriors fighting. So that could be any war, or it could be no war. It's just a generic theme. But on the other side of the cup, we see, and here I do need to, yes. Here we go. So we have a warrior, and on his back is an old man. You can tell he's old because he has no hair. And then here you see two legs of a boy behind him. So we have three figures there. The warrior is the only one you can really recognize, but warrior carrying a man on his back with a boy. By process of elimination, that becomes the story of Aeneas, who flees Troy with his father and his son, his father on his back because his father can't walk. And so they flee. And that then helps us with the other side of the cup as being part of the Trojan War, probably the fall of the Troy, others fighting scenes going on. And this one scene on the other side of the cup helps us to identify it. Another cup, and this one is in the exhibition, and I invite you to look at it, shows a man and a woman there in the center. And if we turn the cup, you can see it a bit better. You see that the woman is standing there, and her face used to be painted white, and that's flaked off, but she's pulling the veil, so she's unveiling herself to the man. And that's called the anakalusis. It's a bridal gesture. Now, when the bridegroom comes to the house, he sees the bride, she unveils herself, he takes her wrist and he leads her to his chariot and takes her to his house, and that's the marriage ceremony. Not a lot of wedding planning going on. So, but usually bridegrooms don't come fully armored. And you'll notice his sword is out and pointing at her. And you don't usually do that with the bride. So what's going on? You have kind of two incongruous moments, warrior and bride. And the thing is, that's another unique scene. And it has to do with Menelaus and Helen. And Menelaus, when they finally sacked Troy, his first intent was to kill Helen. But then he saw her beauty, her face, and he was smitten, and he said, "Let's go home, honey." And she became Queen of Sparta once again. So it's that incongruity that cues the viewer as to what the scene is on the vase. But I would ask a question: who's the more important figure here, Helen or Menelaus? One might think Menelaus, because this is a cup, and the cups were in the Greek symposium, the wine party, used by men. And so fighting scenes, and as you can see, there are fighting scenes around the handles, very appealing to a guy who might himself fight in a battle. But when you look at Menelaus in the corpus of vases, there are very few scenes of Menelaus fighting like we saw in the previous plate. That's a one-off. There are dozens and dozens of this scene of Menelaus recovering Helen. And so I would propose that if we think of Menelaus, we don't think of him as great Greek warrior, we think of him as husband of Helen. And I think it points to Helen being an important component here. And that's where the inscription on the bottom of the vase comes in. And you have the Greek transcribed there, but it says, "I am Melusa's prize. She won the girls' carding contest." This cup was said to be found in Taranto, which is on the underside of the heel of Italy. Taranto is a Spartan colony, and Helen is queen of the Spartans. Now, a merchant comes with a bunch of cups, and somebody is buying a cup to give or a vase to give as a present to the winner of the girls' contest. So which vase do you choose? It's probably not Melusa who's choosing it because she was given it. But if you're a Spartan woman, Helen is kind of the ideal Spartan woman. Beautiful, active, lethal. And so Helen, you would think warrior drinking cup, not of much interest to a woman, but Helen would be. And I would say that this is part of the language that the Greek artists are developing. Something that would appeal to a range of viewers. And so you could be a guy and buy this, or you can buy this for Melusa, and it works equally well because I think Helen is actually the protagonist there. Just a couple more. One thing that artists can think about, they have one picture panel, but they can think about vases are three-dimensional. You can't see everything all at once, like a panel painting. And so here we have another wine pitcher, and this shows the blinding of Polyphemus by Odysseus in the Odyssey. So Polyphemus is on the right, a giant cyclops with one eye. Odysseus is trapped in his cave, and so to get out, they need to blind him. So they heat a stake in a fire, he and his surviving men, because Polyphemus has been eating 2 for lunch and 2 for dinner. And the 2 men then plunge the stake into the head of Polyphemus. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the slide on the right, you can't see what's going on here on the slide on the left and vice versa. The geometry of the vase means that the scene has to unfold. So we can look at this as having 2 moments, before and after. And you also have to remember, this is a wine pitcher, so it's not meant to be a static object in a display case. It's something that's moving about as somebody is pouring the wine. So the picture is moving before the viewer. And so you can see maybe the first scene, maybe the second scene, but a lot of artists play with this very creatively in creating the compositions for their narrative. Now I just want to end with this one slide here. This is from the so-called Brygos tomb, and we're getting into red figure, and I've been focusing on black figure because that's when all of this, the infrastructure of this took place, but it continued on into the 5th century and into the 4th century, this export of Athenian pottery. And so here we have a collection of vases, and the cup right here dates to about 490 to 480. It's much earlier than these two and these two, which date to about 470 to 460. So these vases are about 20 years old, newer, younger than this vase here, but they were all placed in the same tomb. So the one was an heirloom, and then the others were added to it, and you can see there's some intentionality here. These two are the same shape. They even have similar subjects on the one side. These are Sphinx Rhyta, which are Sphinx obviously being a good kind of decoration for a tomb, but it too has another pursuit scene of a winged woman chasing after a young boy. Now, this is usually labeled as Eos, the goddess of the dawn, chasing Kephalos, a hunter from Attica, or Tithonus, a Trojan prince. And the traditional interpretation is Eos is just female sexuality going wild. But if we think about it, most of these Eos scenes, there are 2 points to keep in mind. One, if we go back to the 6th century, Eos never had wings. So in 490, when these first Eos scenes appeared, the wings were a new addition. So they've changed what Eos looks like, the Greek painters. Second thing is that the Etruscans had these winged male and female figures called vants, and they were protectors of the dead and helped to take care of tombs. So since most of these Eos vases are found in Etruria, could we consider that maybe the Greek artists are adapting their own iconography in order to have a broader appeal to Etruscans? And an Etruscan looking at this could see a figure of a Banth as well as Eos, or maybe both, or either. And I think this is what's going on into the 5th century and then into the 4th century. So I would just leave you with that this trade is dynamic, and narratives shape with that. New narratives are developed. Some don't go anywhere. Some have dozens and dozens of representations, like this one. But it's that dynamic of the trade, the market, the interaction between the artist in Athens and then the viewers and the consumers who are out in Italy, Sicily, Egypt, and elsewhere. And that's how a broad visual language is created. So, thank you.
Okay, it is my great pleasure to welcome our second speaker. Ulla Holmquist Pachas is the director of the Museo Larco in Lima, Peru, and a professor of archaeology and art history at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. Ulla.
You have that. Thank you. Well, hello to everybody. Thank you, David, again for the invitation, not only personally, but also institutionally. It's a pleasure, as a director of the Larco Museum, to be taking part of this exhibition with some of the pieces that the visitors are going to be able to know and to explore. So thank you very much. Okay. Welcome. Thank you for sharing this afternoon with us. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share with you the message in the bottle and to make together the journey to the ancestral world of the Moche hero. I would like to start this talk referring to some common knowledge we might have about ancient Peru. Since the Spanish conquest and for about 400 years, ancient Peru was recognized as the place where the Inca Empire developed. For more than a century now, Machu Picchu, the impressive citadel nestled in the eastern mountains of Cusco, is the symbol of this civilization. And I guess some of you have already been there or will probably travel there someday. You will then also get to know the art of the Incas, such as the jars known as urpus or aribalus, after a Greek name for a similar shape, meant to keep the chicha or corn beer shared in ceremonies and festivities. A colorful and symbolic pictography characterizes the visual language of the empire. It has been during the last 100 years that archaeological research has enlarged our knowledge of our ancient history, and we know now that 14,000 years of cultural development precede the emergence of this vast empire. Before the Inca Empire, different phenomena of political and religious integration succeed at least during the last 3 millennia. Among them, the Moche culture, with the imponent adobe temples of Huaca de la Luna or Huacacao, developed between the year 200 and 850 AD in the northern coast of Peru. The extension of the Moche culture includes 12 coastal valleys that run east to west from the northern Andes into the Pacific Ocean, a cultural area of more or less 800 kilometers of longitude, compared to the much greater expansion of the Inca Empire about 1,000 years later. We owe the initial identification of the early cultural developments in this region to archaeologists like Max Uhle, a German archaeologist who considered the Moche as an early Chimu, and Julio Cetello, Peruvian archaeologist, who also considered that the Muchi culture developed between the Great Chimu Empire. But it was Rafael Larco Hoyle who carried out major scholarship about the Moche, publishing multiple studies on almost all the aspects of this culture and giving it a place in the historical studies. A very important event on Moche scholarship was the Round Table, or Mesa Redonda de Chiclín, that he organized in his hacienda in 1946 with the participation of very well-known North American studies archaeologists. Furthermore, Rafael Larco's greatest legacy for the world has been the formation of the largest and most important Moche collection and the creation of the Museo Larco in 1926. I hope you visit us someday. Yes, and we are about to turn 100 years old now. Soon, soon. The initial studies centered on the magnificent art of the Moche, the awesome portrait heads, or huacos retrato as we know them, their metalwork and creation of sophisticated body ornaments that were also found in tombs made of gold, copper, and various exotic materials, and the complex iconography depicted on the surfaces of fine ceramics that were then drawn and interpreted. The images were compared with the findings of archaeological excavations that began to increase since the late 80s. International public knowledge about the Moche was largely due to the impressive findings of context, such as those of the Lord of Zipan in Lambayeque in the late 80s, the so-called Tutankhamun of the Americas, and those of the Lady of Cao and the Priestess of San Jose de Moro in La Libertad in the early 90s. which are clear evidence of the important role women had in those times. Let's concentrate now in the ceramic picture world of the moche. Hundreds of ceramic containers are painted with complex scenes that portray rituals such as combats, races, feasting ceremonies, as well as mythological episodes, such as human or animal ancestors involved in oracular deciphering. The large iconographic corpus gathered through years of scholarship has been organized and made accessible due to the efforts and dedication of many people. I cannot mention them all. I'm pretty sure I'm going to forget some of them. We have, for example, the Moche Archive at Dumbarton Oaks with the thematic categories of hundreds of scenes. I have to thank Chris Donnan for this, and of course, Donna McClelland. I should also mention the great contribution of Anne-Marie Hockenheim and Jürgen Golte for the understanding of Moche iconography as a visual system to access the culture's cosmovision. Golte insisted in the analysis of composition, location, direction, and opposition of images in the three-dimensionality of these vessels. The accessibility of collections is therefore essential, and that is why 20 years ago, we at the LARCO made accessible our whole collection online, contributing significantly to Moche scholarship. You can access the online catalog. For more than 30 years now, iconographic and contextual analysis of a large corpus of images, several made and supervised by Professor Makowski, for example, at the Catholic University in Lima, has led to the reconstruction of Moche mythological narratives based on a fine and detailed description and identification of personages. Gods, a goddess, ancestors have been identified, and we are learning how to read their myths. One of these personages is present in various Moche ceramic bottles of this important exhibition. So let's get to know him. We can find him not only in the painted scenes, but also in model ones, and in metal objects like funerary masks. Who is him? This personage usually wears a headdress with bird feathers on the back, a feline body or head, snake heads pendants on his ears, a double-headed snake belt, a shirt with a step design, and shows wrinkles on his face and also fangs. He has received different names through time and by different scholars. I will refer to him as the Moche hero. Can we identify a sequence of episodes in which he participates? Well, for doing so, we have to describe his attributes and actions in the different scenarios, his interactions, exchanges, transformations. Which are the powers he needs to do what he needs to do? What does he achieve? And how his saga relates to the whole mythological context. From an ample corpus of images in which he is portrayed, we will identify the episodes of his journey, leaving out some of the very early images to control the chronology, since we all know that myths, while keeping the essential narrative, might change through time. In a relief scene on a ceramic vessel, the Moche hero is portrayed in opposite sides of the container doing two things. To the left, we can see him harvesting lima beans, a kind of legume, accompanied by his friends, a dog and a lizard. To the right, he harvests corn in front of a mythological animal from whose body, filled with lima beans, plants grow. It is interesting to note that lima beans and corn are usually cultivated in a rotation scheme, so to allow the soil to recover nitrogen granted by the legume. These black and white beans were also considered oracles by the Moche, since they carry messages from the ancestral world in their colors and spots. The way they grow, with black and white colors, were perfect to express duality. In some model vessels, we can see the Moche hero flying on a red-headed buzzard, also accompanied by his friend, the lizard, and the dog. Where is he going? We can see that he flies down the mountains, so he might be traveling from east to west, following the direction of the sun. And yes, a great clue comes from a very relevant ceramic bowl in which 4 episodes of the Moche hero's saga were painted, related to his entrance to the ocean, which is the access to the world of the ancestors, the underworld. In this vessel, he's shown interacting with different personages that inhabit the liminal space of the beach and the sea. Among the 4 episodes in this vessel, the first in the sequence should be the one in which the hero does not show wrinkles. He is not wet yet, neither is he aging, but he probably will. The first guardian of the ocean that he encounters in his entrance to the inner world is a sea urchin. They both exchange gifts and powerful objects which the Moche hero might need to continue his journey. We can see he's holding a bag in one hand, and the sea urchin also holds one, but in his negative expression. As part of the visual language of the Moche, using 2 colors allow also for communicating presence or absence. These are the leather bags that keep the lima beans that the hero harvested before. The Moche hero might need the nose ring of the sea urchin so that he can breathe in the underworld. In the next episode, the hero already shows wrinkles. He's aging and getting wetter. He encounters a pufferfish who happens to eat sea urchins, meaning that we are moving up in the food chain. The pufferfish holds the bag with lima beans, and the Moche hero wears the nose ring he obtained in exchange, as well as net bracelets. To continue his journey, he might need the owl god helmet that the guardians of the dark world wear, so that he can see in the deep. In Moche ceramics, we can find various pictorial and model scenes in which the hero confronts marine creatures, obtaining and incorporating their abilities and powers. The Moche leaders were buried with these powerful clay bodies that would confer them the necessary knowledge for crossing the thresholds into the world of the ancestors. One of the most relevant episodes of the Moche hero saga is the capture of the sea snail Strombus in the depths. This inhabitant of the sea, with a spiral shape and a strong shell, channels the sacred voice of water. This snail is the ancestral trumpet of the Andes, with which communities are summoned to agricultural tasks. Its name in Quechua is Guayaquepa, the one that greens the fields. The Moche hero captures it so that later he can offer it to the god of the mountains, who will allow the water to return to the coastal fields from there. The next episode corresponds to the final confrontation and death of the hero. We can see some of the changes that the hero has undergone. He has changed his headdress. He has become more and more wrinkled. And his step shirt has inverted its colors. The hero confronts the maximum guardian of the threshold to the world of the death and will be decapitated by him. This is a super powerful deity, inhabitant of the deep world and darkness, who embodies the power of the sea lion and the shark, predators of the sea and ancestral totemic animals. After being decapitated, the Moche hero loses the headdress with the power of the owl that he had previously obtained, and will be held by 2 birds. A booby, a seabird that flies between the beach and the islands, and a red-headed buzzard, a scavenger bird that finds its food in the ravines and coastal cliffs. They will transport the Moche hero to the Temple of the Islands, once dead. The Moche hero appears both in painted scenes and in sculptural ceramic vessels in a temple in the islands, which is surrounded by marine beings and that has stairs leading down. The hero is shown with his bare head and is accompanied by the dog and the lizard. On the other side of the painted scene, he's being attended by an owl she shaman who will cure, regenerate, and reweave him with the help of spiders. This episode is also modeled in a ceramic piece from the Peabody Museum at Harvard University, in which the hero lays in a coffin, and the healer prepares to revive him and bring him back to life using threads and other healing instruments such as rattles, concoctions, seeds, and plants. Having recovered his power and vitality, the Moche hero copulates with the goddess, irrigates the seeds, and from that union, the tree of life is born within the earth. In this way, his body is the channel that allows the cycle of life to restart, and thus the food for his community grows again. In one of the Moche ceramic vessels that you will be able to appreciate at this exhibition, a very relevant episode of the hero's journey is depicted. Among the hero feats, he has managed to obtain the maximum offering from the world of the ancestors. He carries these shells in front of with his friends, the dog and the lizard. He carries the shells to present it to the god who keeps the water in the temple. This god, wearing the owl headdress, guards the mountain threshold from which the powerful vital force of the water will reemerge. The powerful vessel heads, the portrait heads of the community leaders, priests, and warriors also reach the altar of the god, channeling the flow of the water towards their communities. The hero's journey has followed the path of the sun god through the underworld. The hero shows the sun the way back to the world above using the ladder woven by spiders so that he can return to shine in the heights. It is there where the moon goddess also shines. While in the underworld live the owl god who guards the water in the mountain and the ancient god organizer of the world with spider features and a large powerful head with octopus tentacles. In the underworld, the ancestors of communities who look like the hero but do not wear a headdress also interact with him. The Moche hero shares knowledge and wisdom with them like the oracular reading of the lima beans. The detailed iconographic and contextual reconstruction of the Moche hero's journey shows him traveling through the worlds. He first follows the sun from the mountains to the sea. He encounters different creatures and obtains the necessary powers to enter the underworld. He dies in a confrontation with the super powerful guardian of the dark world. In the islands, he will be regenerated, healed by the owl Shishaman, and finding his way back to the mountains, he will present the owl god the spiral shells with a voice of water. Potent again, the hero will unite with the goddess, allowing for the cycle of life to continue, bringing food and wellness to his community. Let's share some conclusions. Ethnohistorical and ethnographic knowledge informs us about cultural practices, rituals, and mythological narratives at the time of the Spanish conquest during the 16th century AD. But the Moche culture developed 1,000 years before. There is undoubtedly permanence and cultural continuity in many of the practices and in the worldview of the original cultures of the Andean area. But we must insist on the importance of contextual analysis of the material evidence in its own time and space. We are developing better methodologies to describe, identify, and interpret the mythological narratives of cultures that use graphic communication systems that were different from those of the Western world. Not having written sources is not an excuse, neither an impediment for studying ancient cosmovision. We are approaching an indigenous ontology that informs us of an intimate coexistence between all beings of a community, including places of power, human beings, plants, animals, climatic fluctuations, and cycles of nature. We can learn from this knowledge for a better coexistence in the present and in the future. Before we leave, what about the mythological narratives in which other personages or deities portrayed in the picture world of the Moche participate? Well, their mythological narratives are being reconstructed. Some late Moche painted ceramics even present episodes in a sequential way, like the beautiful ceramic bottle that also participates in this exhibition. In it, the moon goddess is the protagonist. this story, her story, is to be continued. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ulla. And I think that really demonstrated not only the role that these images play in the circulation of narrative, but the importance and value of a great storyteller to communicate that. I'd like to hand over next I'm delighted to welcome Stephen Houston, who is Dupuy Family Professor of Social Science at Brown University. Steve.
Thank you very much, David. And I also have treasured this opportunity to be with these extraordinary objects that are on display nearby, but also to learn so much from these stimulating presentations. Now, my talk is going to be dealing with a very different kind of civilization, and I felt it would be most remiss of me not to give you a little bit of a background. The first has to do with the physical setting, and it's one that's not too terribly far from here as a jet might fly from LAX, and this takes us down to the Maya region, which essentially includes most of the Yucatan Peninsula and surrounding areas. The other thing to know about the setting for the ceramic narratives that I'll be speaking about this afternoon have to do with their temporal setting. We're roughly dealing with a time in the latter part of the first millennium CE, that is after the beginning of the Common Era. And it's also a time in which there is an intense amount of dynastic competition, conflict, and also comity between a variety of, you might call them even city-states, very roughly speaking, that would include places like Tikal. I must also tell you that it is a civilization that it was richly endowed with many hieroglyphic inscriptions, which we've been able to decode among a small handful of scholars over the past 30 to 40 years or so. Another aspect of the setting, which takes us firmly into the kinds of discussions that both Ulla and Mark have been describing for you thus far, is what I would describe as the material setting. This is a pot that is down in Lakma, and you'll notice that it is essentially square in plan view because it probably was intended to reproduce an ancient and mythic palace. These kinds of pots are, as you can tell, also replete with many hieroglyphic texts that are accompanying the images nearby and help to explicate them in ways that we'll be talking about a little bit later. But I must also tell you that the number of these narrative pots is exceedingly small, and perhaps they were commissioned under the circumstances that Mark was describing. We don't know even how they moved around, whether through gifting networks or through market mechanisms. These still remain for us great mysteries. But the majority of Maya painted ceramics are more or less completely ignored by most art historians and archaeologists, are ones such as these, which I excavated at the ancient city of Piedras Negras. And they date to approximately about 600 years into the Common Era. And so we're dealing here with a sample of figural narrative pottery, which is somewhat small in size, but it's also very limited and circumscribed temporally. So that, for instance, this pot, which dates to approximately the 9th century AD, or the Common Era, in fact, is bracketed by a relatively small inventory of ceramics that we might describe as narrative. The earliest ones are probably inscribed in these pots under the rather stern influence of a foreign civilization that's centered on the city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico. This is one of the very first narrative pots, heavily conditioned and inflected by these foreign influences. And among the very last are these molded ceramics, which are ways of disseminating an image. We have molded objects, obviously, in the two other traditions we've looked at thus far. This is probably one of the last figural scenes that can be firmly attested in the Maya world. It comes to us from approximately 850 CE or AD. Now, this material setting, and this, of course, brings us to what Mark was describing before, is one that involves kinetics as part of these acts of storytelling. Conventionally, most of us look at Maya pottery lately by means of these highly artificial but useful rollouts that were pioneered by my good friend Justin Kerr in New York City about 30 to 40 years ago. And in point of fact, you would only be able to see one of these images on such a vase in a particular time. You'd have to pivot that vessel to be able to apprehend, to be able to absorb in your mind and reconstitute in your mind an entire image, which would never be visible all at once to someone holding this pot. So it is a vignetted kind of narrative, and that's something we're still trying to disentangle. The other thing we can say by way of the kinetic interaction with the pot is, as Mark was pointing out, these are objects. They're portable. They have their own degrees of transmissibility and their ability to be held. Now, these are Justin Kerr's hands in his very own home. And you can see that where he clutches and cradles this vessel is one that would allow the circumambient text to be visible, but not the scene below. These are interacting, therefore, in a kind of kinetic fashion with the way the human hand would hold these objects in space. Another aspect of the settings that I want to lay out for you this afternoon is linguistic. And the fact of the matter is there are approximately 29 or so Mayan languages, many highly distinct from one another. But it is a tradition that continues down to the present, and that's been studied by brilliant folklorists and anthropologists such as the late Robert Laughlin. This is a Maya gentleman in a market in Highland, Guatemala. When we listen to their stories, one way is to approach them rather analytically, to treat them as isolated, I might say, insects frozen in amber, as though they sit there by themselves. But as Mark very beautifully explained in his presentation, these are part of a sociolinguistic or a storytelling setting in which there is, to be sure, a kind of internal structure or content that we can say it's a narrative. But I prefer, as with Mark, to describe, and Ula, to describe these in terms of storytelling, of recipients, of people that are speaking. In this, we're not just looking at the internal structure of that story, we're looking at it as an act, we're looking at the speakers, we're looking at the audience, and we are looking at the intent of telling that story to begin with. And so we can also derive from this rich ethnographic evidence, still very vital today, understandings of genre, of kinds of speech that are told, as has been well studied among the Tzotzil Maya of Chiapas, Mexico, in which there would be certain kinds of stories, certain kinds of speech that were particular to men or to women or to children. There could be scolding speech, there could be polite speech, there could be baby talk, and above all, and most pertinent to the ceramic stories that I'll be describing this afternoon, there would be a form of ritual address, the one that would be constrained in a variety of ways. How would these be structured? Well, frequently, in a rather archaic pattern that goes far back into time and continues to the present, there would be a series of semantic parallels, or couplets, we might even call them. Not the rhyming that might be familiar to you in poetry, but rather ones in which we have a cascade of different ways of speaking about the same thing. Watch over him for me, it would be then accompanied by a sequence statement, look after him for me. The inside of his back, the inside of his side. And through that semantic cascade, that waterfall of meaning, eventually you will get a degree of supplementation, of a kind of story which eventually will result in fusions of meaning. Now, it doesn't take, again, a great deal of perception to understand that relationship between the deciphered writing system and what you might see in a rollout such as this, which is from a pot that's at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, is that same degree of supplementation and fusion, but not simply spoken, but as laid out in a harmonious blending, at times almost contrastive and tense, in fact, between the text and the image. To give you one example from this pot that is taken from the holdings of the Museum of Fine Arts, although ultimately it came from northern Guatemala, we have a text that begins with a date. This is the Maya specifying a time in a mythic moment for you. And then there is inserted into that text, right before the verb, the object that's being described subsequently. They're being brought together. A part of the narrative field is being incorporated into the text. And down below in decipherable Maya of the time, they're rating. We have a text that reads peta, to make round. What is being made round? It's the object that's inserted itself forcibly into that text. Now, as part of this linguistic setting, I would also like to tell you this afternoon that these are noisy objects, I presume, as do many interpreters, of they're objects that emanate their own kind of vocalization, their own sort of sound, so that you, although only viewing it with your eyes, would probably in a kind of synesthetic way be able to hear it as well. Now, how is this indicated? How is this vocalization, this loudness of the pots underscored for you through visual and hieroglyphic terms? Well, the first thing we can notice on this pot are a series of monkeys. They are howler monkeys, who are the noisiest creatures in Christendom. They wake you up in the morning, they prevent you from sleeping at night. And you'll notice that these two monkeys have their heads basically angled upwards. Their mouths are wide open, almost gap-jawed. They are emitting the noise that they are associated with. And a knowledgeable viewer would be able to hear, in a sense, that sound that is rippling out and reverberating from this object. Whenever you see a howler monkey, including an object that comes from the city of El Zotz. I actually excavated this object with a colleague who is here today. The head is angled back, the mouth is wide open, and is letting loose a throaty roar for you. This is not just in the pottery. The noisiness of the pot, the vocalizations, which could lend themselves to an understanding in turn of storytelling, is also found in inscriptions, in the carved texts that were left by the Maya. These, highlighted for you, are a series of glyphs in which a snake head is open, a toad or a frog has opened its mouth as well. There's a jaguar to the side, and each one of those is also making a loud racket that would be appreciable to a knowledgeable viewer. This even occurs in the hieroglyphs themselves. This is a recently excavated panel found by a colleague, Marcelo Canuto, at the city of La Corona in Guatemala, and drawn here by David Stewart, in which the glyphs themselves are not just representing speech. In a sense, they are enunciating their content with their open jaws, as you can see here in the examples that I've highlighted for you in red. So what we're looking at here, though, as part of this afternoon's discussions are, of course, storytelling and narrative as seen in a more interpretive, analytical fashion. And I think there are larger questions to be asked here, one of which is, what does a text do in these images? What do the pictures happen to accomplish? And then, what are you supposed to do as you would go later into the galleries? You would be participating in this activity. What are readers and viewers intended to accomplish in turn as they might view these objects? Now, for me, these are focal objects of storytelling. That is, they are about stories that have rich content, that involve many different characters, and only part of that is visible in the moments that were being described by Mark before. I believe these are prompts for performance. I believe that there is also storytelling that would take place in response to the pots that you would see in mute displays, perhaps in museums such as this one. Now, the other point I want to make here, as I can get towards the conclusion of my brief presentation today, is that there are different kinds of storytelling among the Maya, just as we saw richly attested, profoundly attested among the ethnographic Maya today, the living Maya. These are two examples. One is a rollout, one is a photograph of a pot that is down in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. One is showing, in fact, a contemporary, if you will, a now world. I've placed that in brackets there, or quotations, single apostrophes, to indicate that this is the time of the classic period. This is the time of living or near-living dynasts, maybe they've just passed away, who are being depicted on these kinds of objects. Now, in the example that's visible to you over to the right, this is in a very distant time, far, far beyond the ken of any living Maya. In fact, probably taking place about 2,000 to 3,000 years, 3,000 years in the past. There are blurrings here, which I think get to the nub of what is taking place with many of the narratives that we are describing today. If we examine these two instances, I'm going to capture for you now some of their paradoxes. For instance, these are prince and courtiers displayed on that rollout, but in point of fact, they are impersonating gods. They're impersonating deities. So there's already a kind of blurring of identity, of role. And similarly, over to the side, it is a scene with gods, but it's part of a pot that was the treasured belonging of a prince, the offspring of a royal house from the city of Naranjo in northern Guatemala. There are other blurrings, including this pot that is on display not too far from here in the Getty, in which we have a noisy, boisterous, raucous scene of a variety of beings that I identified with David Stewart about 30 years ago. These are the Wai. They are the spirits, apparently, of dynastic figures, of lords. They are the alter coessences. They're nightmares and dreams that you might have, but are always tethered to your own physical and spiritual identities. But there's little evidence of this particular image that any of these are of living rulers. We could be looking at here beings that existed in very, very distant time. Now here's the paradox in that the owner of this pot, and I've highlighted his ownership for you here in color, is a ruler of the royal house of Motu de San Jose, or an area not too far from Flores in northern Guatemala. And so there's a kind of disconnect here, a blurring between the owner who's palpable, who's living part of that society, and then images that take you into an almost impossibly distant past. There is another difficulty or challenge we have in working with these materials, and that is, what do we do with characters such as Ula was describing before, mythic beings, who appear to be part of larger stories. But the question is, what are those stories? Now let's look at one of these beings. Which is the implied story? Which one are we to select? This being is a personage that we call conventionally God El. That was not his ancient name. But we do know that he has a variety of attributes, one of which is that he has a wizened body. He's elderly, like me. He's got a lot of wrinkles, and he does not, unlike me, who is about to have cataract surgery, he has eagle eyes. He's someone of high perception and of great insight. He has jaguar marks at times on his face. He is hairy, which is often a sign of age, unlike apparently ancient Greece. The hairier you are, the more elderly among the classic Maya. So this aged aspect is also accompanied by another attribute, which is that he is nocturnal. He's a being of the night, which is always a scary time, regardless of whatever society you might have lived in. He tends to wear the same kind of broad hat. Often it has owl feathers. The owl himself obligingly perches right above, presumably making his own rather unsettling calls. And then he is equipped with treasure, with collars of jade beads, and sometimes he'll wear different garments. He might have a rough weave cape, and sometimes he would have a jaguar pelt, probably indicating different aspects of his personality. But we can also say that he's associated with trading activity. He's someone who travels widely. He is the rich god. He is the one who is endowed with lots of treasure, including plumes of the quetzal bird and chocolate beans. And those chocolate beans were eventually ground and made into the drinks that would have been consumed from the pots that you would see in the gallery nearby. But if you see that god just in a single image, what I would call a singleton, we have to ask ourselves today, since we're not part of the knowledgeable audience that would have been probably expected for these pots, is which story is he a part of? Now we have some choices here. One story would be that he is part of a harem scene he's a rather lascivious, oversexed elderly god. He has his trophy wives nearby, and he's also frequently accompanied by a trickster being, a rabbit, who is mischievously cooking the books nearby. And there is also the real scribe who is being decapitated, presumably by some mischief from the scribe himself. So these are ambiguous, ambivalent images, and yet they are, of course, have as one of their personages, one of their stock players here, God El. He is also involved, though, in other activities, such as at the very beginnings of time. He is summoning and bringing together, orderly assembly, many sinister gods. And that is present on this pot, and also in the one that I was showing before that is down in the LA County Museum of Art. But that's just one of the stories. We could also pick, finally, one other, which is that he is a deity that is frequently accompanied by another god, whose name anciently was Awil. He seems to be somewhat ambiguous as to his nuances of meaning or as what his roles might have been, but probably linked to ideas of lightning blasts, of vegetation that would grow. And here you can see him on a vase, a little bit like the alabastron that Mark was showing before for perfume. These actually were employed mostly for tobacco snuff, and probably were kind of branded object in which they'd be filled with the best possible snuff and then traded around. And the fact of the matter is that this particular conjuncture of God El with this other deity, perhaps connected ultimately with the propitious harvesting and growth and harvesting again of tobacco, which is what would have been a crop of great value to the Maya, is also found on many different pots. And so the question we're always asking ourselves is, which role is being laid out for us on these objects? Which roles are being emphasized? Now, the late Linda Sheely, who was a profoundly important person in Maya studies, said to me long ago, one of the things that she eventually discovered, to her regret, was that these objects were simply not meant for us. They're not meant for us to understand. We claw at their understanding, at an ability to comprehend their nuance through years and decades of scholarship, but ultimately we stand somewhat outside of that world. And so that's the challenge before us in looking at narrative. As an anthropologist, I also have to pose the most important question of all, though, which is, how do these stories function on these pots? And I would insist that they are never, and I think all of the speakers today would agree with this, they're never self-contained. They're always part of larger cycles and traditions of storytelling. The moments being selected, as Mark put it, is something that we need to isolate, but we still don't quite have a grasp of what might be going on here. There's a world outside of those objects which are on display here at the Getty, and that is the world that floats around them, that encircles them, and that we wish ultimately to penetrate insofar as we can. I think these pots had a variety of roles. We believe some of them must have been highly amusing. There's a pot in the display case in the third room, which was probably uproarious to the Maya, involved procreation of rabbits beyond control. And you can see almost through the centuries a smile and even hear a laugh of the Maya who would fill in the story and tell us something more about what might be going on. There would, I think, almost certainly be a pleasure in the exquisite execution of some of these pots. There would be a great enjoyment of their quality, of their skill, of knowing that this or that work would be created by a particularly important painter. And then there are, I think, proverbial lessons. There are tales of wisdom and of folly, which we can expect of all humans, and is laid out here in their mythological template. There might also be ultimately a kind of explanation for the way the world is and the way it should be. And so I would conclude with this slide by simply saying that the ultimate purpose here is to affirm the existence of unprovable realities, to know that they existed because you see them palpably on the surface of these pots. You see texts and you can read inscriptions and in a sense hear what is coming off of those vessels. And these affirmed realities ultimately take you to that transcendent place which you too will occupy when you go into the gallery to see these objects, and you will begin to make that connection to distant worlds, times, places, peoples, painters, and patrons. Thank you.
That was fabulous, Steve. Incredibly rich and so much to think about. Thank you to our first three speakers for keeping so assiduously to time as well. I'm looking at the back of the room. Is it permissible to open the floor for a couple of questions, or is that not a good idea? Does anyone in the audience have anything they want to ask any of the first three speakers? Or not? No? Okay, I'll take that as... We do? Okay, we do.
Hi. On the moche pots, upstairs in the gallery, there's a pot that I really love that shows lima bean warriors. And to our eye, our modern eye, or at least to my modern eye, they're very humorous and funny. And I just wonder if there's a deeper interpretation to these lima bean warriors and what they might signify.
From here? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the question. Yeah, the lima beans are such a very interesting image, participants of the moche world. And there are several interpretations. Long ago, for example, Rafael Lorca thought that there was a system of, a code in the lima beans. He even spoke about a writing system, but later on, of course, we now know that it's because the way the spots and the colors they have could have been part of oracular games and deciphering, because they participate in these readings of mythological beings. Now, the lima beans grow a lot. Like, they grow 4 times a year if you take care. So it's like a seed of bountiness, kind of, no? And the other thing is that they are kind of toxic if they are not well cooked, because they have a lot of nitrogen also, and some scholars consider that because some animals can get, like deer, when they eat a lot of these, get kind of crazy, they are presented as in battles between these ancestral figures of the deers with the lima beans in these kind of battles. But the lima beans, the warrior lima beans, don't kill anybody. They're just like running around with their weapons, like very happy warriors, kind of, no? So they might also mean or have a symbolic relation with growth and, the force of growing, no, as the expression of war. So we have also to reconsider what we mean by war, no, and by confrontation. So it's more in that realm that we can interpret also these lima beans. And one last thing that is really interesting is that in early times, lima beans were part of the diet, but as soon as they become more representations of lima beans in the mythological realm of the moche, they are out of the daily life consumption. So it's like they become kind of a sacred, no, or important cultigen, because how it's incorporated in the meaning world of the moche. So there's a lot going on about the lima beans, and they're funny and they're very beautiful. Yeah.
Okay, so we will go to a break now. You can pop upstairs and see the lima beans, as well as many of the other figures that are depicted and you've seen. We will resume at 2:40, and I look forward to seeing you back there then. Thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could encourage you to find your way back to your seats. I hope you are sufficiently recharged if you've been able to pop up and see the exhibition, or have enjoyed being able to stretch your legs. Welcome back to part 2, which I'm really looking forward to. We go in this session beyond and deeper and further beyond the study of the 3 specific cultures, and bring in some different perspectives and bring things up to the contemporary day. And I say, really look forward to our 2 presenters this afternoon. First, it's a pleasure to introduce Neil Conn, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Cognition and Communication at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Neil.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, David. Thank you for having me. Though I do live in the Netherlands, I am from Southern California, so it's nice to be home. Thank you for having me for this lovely event. Thank you for the speakers who've already spoken, who gave a really nice overview of each of these sections. And as David said, my role here is to be somewhat integrative of these views, as well as to I think, give a somewhat modern spin or connection to things, as well as going beyond the field of, say, archaeology and art history, which is not, in fact, my field. I'm actually a cognitive neuroscientist and linguist, so I'm going to be speaking more to the connection of these things to a broader, say, human understanding of cognition and communication more generally. So the way I'm going to enter into this conversation is simply by posing, say, 3 of our examples from all 3 of these cultures and asking, why do pictures from different places have different representations to begin with? Right? Why is it that these different places actually look different in the graphics that they demonstrate, as we've seen lovely examples in the previous presentations? And part of one of the reasons why this is an interesting question is because, at least in contemporary terms, we tend to think of the creation of pictures in a few different ways. So the first of those is basically with regard to, say, drawing, right, is picture making. Now, if you were going to draw me, for example, the idea goes something like you're going to look at me and then articulate what you see in a way that draws something that resembles like me. And this is typically called drawing from perception or life drawing. The other way that we tend to think about drawing is if you don't have me in front of you, but you want to still draw me, you conjure me in your mind and then draw from that mental image of me, which is typically called drawing from memory or from imagination. Now, this overarching kind of belief about how drawings work and how pictures work is entirely meaning that pictures are tied to perception. Pictures are a reflection of what you see, whether by eye or by mind. But if this were the case, there's a variety of things that don't quite add up with this view. First of all, if this were the case, why is it that styles, like patterned representations, are recognizable across people within a culture or within a population? And similarly, why then are these sorts of styles also recognizable and different between cultures or populations? If picture making was simply tied to a single person's vision of the world, this shouldn't be possible because you wouldn't have this sort of regularity both between people within a population and across differences that are recognizable. So I'm going to offer you an alternative view of what is going on with the nature of pictures to begin with. And to do that, I need to actually ask you some questions first. So, and I mean it. So, first of all, let me ask you, can you speak? Yes. Thank you. Oh, really good audience participation. I love it. Okay. Second, what do you speak in? English, with a very resoundingly English. We're definitely in southern Los Angeles. I think I heard at least some other things I said. What else did I hear? Words, language, body, sounds, okay. All right, let's move on to the next one. Can you draw? Oh, so much more mixed responses to that question. But now let me ask you, given that, let me ask you, what do you draw in? So pencil, a lot of stunned silence, not sure quite what to say, right? Now, does this sound like a weird thing to ask as a standard question, right? Now, what I have done is I've asked you parallel sets of questions, which I think deserve parallel sets of answers. So, can you speak? Yes, I speak in a spoken language, specifically Spanish or English or Japanese or any of the variety of spoken languages that occur throughout the world. And so the parallel would be, can you draw? I draw in a, huh? What? Specifically, what? Right? What fills this gap? Right? We don't have ways that we talk about this in standard terms, at least in English, for the way this gap is filled that would be parallel. And what I propose is to fill it with a term that people have been using today already, which is, can you draw? I draw in a visual language, specifically American visual language like the way that superhero comics are drawn, or Japanese visual language, which is the visual language that's used in, say, manga and anime from Japan and elsewhere. or many others. That is, I draw in a visual language if you draw in a visual language, if you have actually learned a visual language the same way that you may have learned a spoken language. So this provides us an alternative construal for how we conceptualize what pictures are in the first place. And as I've been arguing now for many years, the structure of pictures is actually organized and structured the same as any other language. And I mean this in a non-metaphorical way. I mean this in a very literal, cognitively driven way. So visual languages use a visual vocabulary that's made up of patterned representations. Those are built of memorized or patterned units, but flexible enough that you can create novel forms, right? We create new words all the time, new phrases all the time. These units are ordered by a grammatical system. There's also cross-cultural or cross-linguistic diversity of these systems. So that is, there's not one universal visual language, but rather relative visual languages around the world and times, depending on the populations that use them. And insofar as these are real languages that are not metaphorical, we would imagine that the brain would use similar cognitive processing for the processing of visual languages as we would for any other linguistic system, like spoken languages. And I won't speak to that as much, but that's been a primary focus of my work for the last 20 years, and indeed it is the case. So, as we can already see by the representations that we've seen in the presentations before, we have systematic different visual languages that we've been talking about throughout. So the representations on these Greek vessels are a representation of a Greek visual language, or the variety of Athenian, etc., types that have been described, perhaps with various dialects, as Mark so eloquently described. The moche have a consistent, persistent representation to their style, which is reflecting of their visual language. And similarly to the Maya, which also have a consistent visual language in their representations. We can focus in on this of, what is it that motivates these visual languages? Well, they have visual vocabulary. For example, the way in which faces are drawn in the Maya vessels. They all consistently use similar representations of eyes and noses and the particular shape of the head and the mouth. They have particular patterns that are repeated across vessels, across authors, across time, that allows you to then add up those pieces and say, oh, these are all tied to certain people who do things this way, and I know that these people use this visual language. We can tell that these patterns are also different than those that are used, for example, by the Greek vessels, which have different ways in which they depict eyes that are still systematic within that. These are, of course, different than the systematic ways that are typically found in what I call Kirbian, or the American visual language stereotypical of superhero comics, or the Japanese visual language used in manga, that have their own distinctive ways and elements that get combined to create novel representations that we see in different pictures. We can also see this systematicity in larger scenes. So in the Maya representations, there are certain poses and hand shapes, like the posture of royal ease, of somebody sitting on a throne and having particular types of hand gestures. This sort of scene is repeated throughout these vessels. Or in the scenes that we find in the Greek vessels, we find these triumvirates, where there's a central figure with two figures facing in. Notice also that the central figures in both of these cases has the same pose. So that is also a systematized aspect of their visual vocabularies. These aspects of the systematic nature of scenes is something that we've been extensively investigating. So we've been building in my research groups several corpora or databases of information about different comics, in this case, of the visual languages used in comics. In this case, first we have this, as reported in my recent book, The Patterns of Comics, a collection of 9 countries, the US from Europe and Asia, 48,000 panels from roughly 360 comics. And I'm just going to talk about one feature of these, which is the density of information in each panel. So a panel that uses multiple active characters that are interacting is what I call a macro panel. And that you can distinguish that from, say, a mono panel, which has only a single character in that panel. So multiple characters versus a single character. You can also have less than a single character, such as is often found with like close-ups. or you can have environmental information alone, which is what we call an amorphic panel. Now, if you look at the distribution of these panels across these types of comics, what you see is this. In all of the comics from Europe, you have a consistent trend of showing far more scene panels than you do single character panels or these other types of panels. This persists also in classic American comics from, say, before the 1980s, that's 1940s to 1980s. Contemporary American comics, whether they're superhero comics or indie comics, use the same sort of more macros than the other types, but at a lower ratio. And US-made manga, or original English language manga, start changing that, so they start getting more balanced. And if you look at actual manga, these ratios flip quite a bit. There's now using fewer macros than all of the other things, and this persists in other Asian comics as well. So this would appear as if it was a Western versus Asian cross-cultural difference. Now, one thing that we don't have in here, except for the American-made manga, is a crossing of the styles versus the locations. So this has been a focus of our recent study, which is called the Tintin Project. And for this, my postdoc, Bruno Cardozo, built a software program that allows you to annotate visual media across whatever sort of annotation classifications you want to use. It works with comics, could work with vessels, it could work with anything that's visual. And in our case, we built an analysis of 1,030 comics from 144 countries around the world, comprising roughly 76,000 panels. And we probably have close to 1 million annotations at this point. And so if we look at these dimensions now with a much bigger, wider, diverse sample, what we get is this. And here, I'm not even showing you countries anymore because it would look like just a smear of data. So what we find across cultures, at least by region, is that those from Europe, North America, and Oceania all maintain that same pattern of more macros than other sorts of panels. And then when you shift to other populations, that ratio changes. So again, right, it looks like we have a cross-cultural effect here going on. However, if you now split that up by different styles, and here's what I'm going to show you is now a ratio of macro panels versus all of the other ones. So a 0 here would mean that you have an equal number of macros as all the rest. Positive values would mean you'd have more macros than the rest, and negative would mean you'd have more of the other stuff than the macros, the full scene panels. And now, if you look at these cultural locations crossed with the styles, what you get is this. Cartoony comics generally hover around the balance case. Superhero comics are right around there too. So are realistic comics. But manga are not. They have less complex panels, no matter where they come from. So if people are drawing manga wherever they come from in the world, it has a particular structure. So that would imply this is not a cross-cultural effect, but rather more of a cross-linguistic effect of visual languages. In the same way that English has its particular unique patterns and structures no matter where it's spoken around the world, although it might vary around the world. So this is then speaking to structural properties of visual languages that are not purely about culture. Okay. One additional aspect of this is when you show patterns of sequences to people and measure their brain responses, and these are shows of that. This is the head of people looking at the electrical activity of their head. It's like you see their nose is on top, the ears are on the side. I have a particularly good head to demonstrate this. What you end up seeing is if you show people patterns that are common to Japanese manga, people's brains respond in a different way if they read manga versus if they don't read manga, which essentially is saying there's a culture-specific or visual language-specific fluency depending on what things you're exposed to, just like any other language. All right, another facet of this that I'd like to highlight is demonstrated by this lovely vessel that we've been seeing quite a bit. I've actually known about this vessel for many years, and I was delighted to actually see it in person for the first time today. So the description of this in the exhibit reads, 2 men with spots on their skin shoot pellets at water birds that fly, walk, or fish. Now, what I want to first highlight is there's a particular trait here that's, I think, interesting. And it might be easier to see if we pull up these two parts of the scene apart, and then actually note that it's read from right to left in this particular representation. So let's just flip it around so we're used to it, so it's left to right. And then what you see is maybe this is not two men shooting. This is one man shooting one bird in a sequence, right? Now, what's particularly interesting about this is that in order to do this, you need to have certain types of knowledge of what I call the continuity constraint, which is you have to recognize that one set of lines corresponds to some sort of identity, and that another set of lines also corresponds to the same identity, what's called co-reference in linguistics. So in this case, these set of lines both correspond to the same identity of a hunter, and these sets of lines both correspond to a bird that allow you to then make a sequential order out of them, right? So if you were to fail at the continuity constraint, you would perceive these as different characters and potentially different scenes. That is, these are two hunters rather than one hunter across an event, or one bird across an event. Now, this might seem like, oh, this is very trivial, right? Of course we can recognize this as one entity. We do this all the time. You do this in instruction manuals. You do this in comics. Of course, this is natural and easy to do. Well, it turns out, if you look at studies just in contemporary society of people who are given, say, things that look like comics, sequential images, in fact, there are populations that can't do this. And those people often come from rural areas who are illiterate and have little experience with Western visual narratives. Now, obviously, the creation of spatially sequential visuals isn't tied to just Western visual narrative as we see it on Maya vessels, right? But in a contemporary sense, these people don't have experience with this. Generally, literacy and comics experience increase this proficiency, although it might not be literacy itself. It could just be enculturation and exposure to sequential images of this type. It's also the case that kids don't get this for free. So if you average across various studies that use sequential images in them, what you end up seeing is a by-age progression in children's performance on understanding a sequence of images. So across a variety of tasks. It's just as children age, they get better and better at understanding a sequence of images. And the crucial age seems to be somewhere between 4 and 6 if they're exposed to visual narratives. That's when they start getting this continuity constraint. So if you ask a child who's younger than 4, they might not understand that this set of lines and these set of lines correspond to the same character. And I have a 1.5-year-old at home, and I'm definitely going to be experimenting on him. Don't tell my wife. OK, so this sort of construal is the start of more complex sequential characteristics. And for here, I'd like you to, again, do some audience participation. This is a sequence of images, as you might see in a comic. Tell me, by holding up your fingers, how many moments are taking place here? OK, so I see some 5s, some 2s, some 3s, pretty consistent across the 2s, 5s, and 3s. All right, so that's actually fairly common. And so here are the things that we need to know about this sequence. First of all, using this continuity constraint, we need to make a connection between the character in this first panel and the character in this last panel, because those are the same, we recognize them as the same character. We might also recognize these clocks as being the same clocks, and so those need a connection as well. So one interpretation is that the sequence of the clocks happens within the sequence of the man. And in this case, each of those panels represents their own moments. So for those of you who held up 5 fingers, this is your interpretation. However, there's another interpretation, at least one other interpretation, is that the first 2 panels actually happen at the same time within a common environment. These are happening at the same time in the same place. And the last 2 panels are happening at the same time in the same place. And then you connect those across a shift in time that has the central panel, which is fully ambiguous. So those of you who are saying 2 are probably grouping that middle panel with either of the other sides. And when you ask this to large groups of people, you basically get this distribution, which is largely what you guys said. Either 3 or 5, and some people say 2. Not many people say 4, and some wisecracking people will say 6. And this process of comprehending a sequence of images indeed can be structurally ambiguous, depending on the ways that you group information together. And this is just like what happens when you process a sequence of words. There's structural ambiguities in how words might group together in phrases. And as I alluded to before, in our experimental work on the brain, we actually see that the same brain responses occur to processing of sequential images as you get in processing sequences of words, both for the meanings of the sequences and for the grammar. They have distinctive brain responses, and you get all of those in sequences of images as you do in sequences of words. All right, so that is to say that continuity is the start of more complex visual grammar, and that continuity is on display in some of the vessels upstairs. However, one of the things that people have persistently brought up here is that you don't experience this all at once on these vessels. You have to, say, turn the vessels to be able to get that sequence. So the sequence, it might be unfurled to you as you experience this physical object. And this is not uncommon with other types of phenomena in visual narratives. For example, the emaki were scrolls in Japan from the 11th century, and people wouldn't get the whole scroll. They would only see part of the scroll as they scroll by. This is also what you experience these days if you flip through a webcomic on your phone, and you only get a little bit at a time, but you have to link the sequence across those different glimpses. And this is a lovely paper in a book that I edited by Soren Wichmann and Jesper Nielsen, who analyzed, in fact, these sorts of Maya vessels using linguistic methods. And when speaking about these particular types of vessels, they in fact make a link to the moche that we have already heard about. It says, it bears remarking that very similar ways of narrating stories and myths were employed by the moche culture in Peru on beautifully painted vessels. So already people have noticed this link between the ways in which these sorts of vessels are communicating that we are seeing on display in the exhibits. All right, I want to make one additional observation that comes from this paper, which is not mine, which is we've already heard about the integration of text and image across many of the different types of exhibits that we've seen here, and including the glyphs that are on display in these Maya pots. But I want to highlight one particular feature of this one here, which is, notice, if I get this thing to work, notice there's that little squiggly line there next to the column of glyphs and the person. Now, you might be able to interpret that squiggly line if I provide it to you in a more updated, conventionalized way, which is, these are essentially like antecedents to what we would now use as speech balloons. Now, this is depicting the speech of these characters, and the squiggly line is what I call a tail of this carrier, as it were. So not only are the text-image relationships, say, descriptive or labeling, but they're also integrated in a way that distinctly ties the content of the images to the content of the text in a way that is more integrative than you get from mere labeling alone. Okay, so to summarize, that is to say, in order to understand that these are different phenomena, you have to understand that they are different visual languages. And to truly understand those visual languages, as people have been stressing throughout the day, you need to be fluent or proficient in understanding their diverse visual vocabularies, which we might not know what those visual vocabularies are, because we're not enmeshed in the visual language and the culture that they come from. You need to know how to interpret their grammars, i.e. you need to have at least a continuity constraint, or in order to understand what sorts of properties might be going on within a single picture if they don't have that sort of sequence. And you might potentially need to know how to integrate the writing systems with those pictorial forms in what is ultimately a multimodal experience. Just as I am doing right now for you, as I am speaking and gesturing and integrating that with pictures. So human communication is by default naturally multimodal, not just speech and then all that other stuff that we don't really care about. As we see throughout human history, and the things that are actually persisting in the archaeological record are actually not speech, demonstrating that human communication is much more rich than we often give it credit for in the first place. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neil. I think there's a number of really intriguing and compelling some strategies to sort of go back to the ancient pottery, with having heard from you this afternoon, seen the approaches we can take. Finally, for our formal presentations today, it is a pleasure to welcome Pilar Tompkins Rivas, who is Chief Curator and Deputy Director of Curatorial and Collections at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art here in Los Angeles. Pilar.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm so delighted to be among such esteemed speakers today to discuss visual storytelling and narrative art. I extend my gratitude to the Getty, David Saunders, Megan O'Neill, Arama Tamian, and the organizers of this event for the kind invitation. Storytelling within art, the legibility of images, and ways in which narrative art has shaped society are ideas that are central to our work at the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art. Slated to open next year in Exposition Park, the Lucas Museum is dedicated to preserving and celebrating visual storytelling. Our collection spans diverse genres and media, including paintings, illustrations, works on paper, photographs, posters, sculptures, and film production materials. A large number of works in the museum collection's holdings focus on murals, recognizing the role in public storytelling and their capacity to engage with broad audiences. Across our unique collection, a unifying link is an objective to demonstrate the numerous approaches artists, illustrators, and filmmakers use to tell visual stories. Through narrative art, we hope people of all ages and backgrounds can find connections between their lives and those of others across eras, cultures, and regions. Storytelling is core to who we are as human beings, and interpreting and understanding the world around us through stories binds societies and humanity. The Lucas Museum's future exhibitions will explore narrative art's cultural and historical impact across time and place, featuring key genres, themes, and artists from its collection. We look forward to emphasizing murals as a powerful form of narrative art, particularly highlighting the work of Judith F. Baca and her monumental project, The Great Wall of Los Angeles. Today, I want to talk about the significance of narrative art, the museum's mission to convey this through its collections, and the critical role of murals in reflecting and shaping societal histories. Narrative art is vital because it allows for the visibility of diverse stories and perspectives. Through images, artists can shape societal narratives, influence public perception, and reflect the complexities of the human experience. The Lucas Museum intends to showcase the breadth and impact of narrative art culturally and historically rooted within the museum's collection. Core to our work is the foregrounding of dialogues between forms of art, illustration, and popular media that have richly shaped our understanding of visual culture, creating a platform for discussion about how narrative images shape, influence, and reflect society. The museum will emphasize how art forms such as murals can convey powerful social histories and foster a deeper understanding of cultural dynamics. We will underscore the social, political, and historical operations of murals as a critical form of narrative art, emphasizing the mural as a vehicle for communicating people's histories in public spaces, making their stories accessible to a wide audience. Our collection includes completed murals, mural panels, mural studies, artworks by key muralists, and other archival materials, touching on mural movements of the 20th century and spotlighting murals throughout the US and Mexico with a focus on Los Angeles, including the preparatory drawings for Baca's masterwork, The Great Wall. The Great Wall Archive encompasses 362 objects related to the mural, such as sketches, studies, process notes, and blueprints. Baca's Great Wall is a seminal work that exemplifies the power of narrative art. This extensive mural, stretching over a half-mile in the San Fernando Valley, here in LA County, chronicles the history of California from prehistory to the 1950s, emphasizing the often overlooked contributions and struggles of marginalized communities. Baca's work challenges dominant narratives and brings suppressed stories to the forefront, offering a counter-narrative to traditional historical accounts. Between 1976 and 1983, Baca led the work of over 400 community youth artists and collaborators to execute the mural. The dynamism of the mural is not only due to the impact of its content, but also the structure of its images. Baca employed the puntos, or points, system developed by Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros to create bold compositions that force perspectives in space, a testament to the historical links between Mexican muralism and the development of muralism in LA. In these studies, for the 1940s section of the mural, we see the deep triangle of an officer's boots overpowering a zoot suiter who has been subjugated and stripped of his drapes on the streets of downtown, while the heroic portrait of Luisa Moreno, civil rights and labor activist and co-founder of the Sleepy Lagoon Defense Committee, pushes forward in a groundswell from the oblique lines of the train and picking field behind her. Here, Baca uses the punto system's sharp geometry to create a cadence of spatial movement for storytelling in the picture plane. Baca's work is part of a broader tradition of muralism that includes Siqueiros as well as influential artists like Diego Rivera and José Clemente Orozco. These artists use murals to tell stories that resonate with the public, addressing themes of social justice, political struggle, and cultural identity. Baca's murals continue this legacy, emphasizing the importance of public art in engaging with and educating communities. Her work specifically draws attention to the stories of people of color in Southern California that have been vulnerable to processes of erasure. Part of an incredible arc of public art in Los Angeles that is transnational and multifaceted, Baca's work punctuates critical histories that have sparked both pride and debate and speak to the contested nature of public space in LA. Muralism and its narratives possess the power to take storytelling into the space of immediate public encounters through an artist's lens. Baca's practice is a form of collaborative storytelling, structured as a cooperative process where participants have a stake in placemaking and the pictorial strategies that empower, educate, and inform political and social understandings of our communal experience. In Los Angeles, narrative murals are vital in reflecting the city's rich cultural landscape. They celebrate the contributions of diverse communities, highlight social and political struggles, and promote cultural understanding. The city's tradition of muralism is marked by essential works such as Siqueiros' 1932 mural, America Tropical, depicting indigenous struggles and criticizing American imperialism. This work set a strong precedent for using public art to address social and political issues, making murals integral to the city's cultural dialogue. Mid-20th century artist Charles White furthered this tradition with works highlighting the African American experience, emphasizing representation and inspiring future muralists. The Chicano mural movement of the 1970s cemented murals as instruments of cultural expression and political activism. Baca is part of a generation of influential Chicanx artists painting the streets of LA. Chicano murals throughout East LA and beyond articulate community struggles and triumphs, showcasing Mexican American and Latinx heritage. Baca's work in particular emphasizes the importance of land, environmental stewardship, and indigenous practices, connecting contemporary issues to historical contexts. In recent decades, the resurgence of muralism has been driven by the street art movement and artists like Shepard Fairey and JR, whose works address social issues and engage global audiences. Today, murals in Los Angeles continue to evolve, reflecting the city's dynamic character and sparking meaningful conversations about identity, history, and social justice. These artworks enhance the visual landscape and foster community engagement. Baca's work sits alongside other notable muralists in the Lucas Museum collection, including Hernando Villa, an early Mexican-American artist born in Los Angeles in 1881, Edward Bieberman, known for his mural in the Venice Post Office, Dean Cornwell, whose murals are a defining feature of the interior of the downtown public library. Charles White, whose mural in tribute of educator and philanthropist Mary McLeod Bethune stands in a library a few blocks from the Lucas Museum. And French artist J.R., whose global practice, rooted in street art and activism, turns a lens on the narratives of contemporary culture, among others. The collection includes mural studies and components related to significant art historical movements. Mexican muralism and its masters are represented, including a fresco panel from Diego Rivera's Portrait of America, produced for the New Workers' School that advocated for socialism, revolutionary movements, and the unity of global workers in opposition to extreme capitalism, as well as fascism and the emergence of Nazism, which is the subject in the panel within the museum's collection. American regionalist movements are also represented in studies by artists like Thomas Hart Benton and John Biggers, who captures the histories of African American life in Texas and the Jim Crow era South, as well as studies tied to the WPA era public works projects, such as designs by Ben Shahn. Within Baca's work, we learn about narratives specific to LA, including establishing Dodger Stadium, now a symbol of civic pride for a beloved team representing the city on a global stage. However, the history of Dodger Stadium, located in Chavez Ravine, reveals a complex entanglement of urban development and displacement. Once a vibrant Mexican-American community known for its cultural richness, Chavez Ravine underwent a controversial urban renewal project in the 1950s, leading to the displacement of its residents and the construction of the stadium. This transformation reflects broader themes of urban planning, social change, in the intersections of culture and development in LA's history. The history of Chavez Ravine underscores the impact of major infrastructural projects on communities and identities. Gentrification continues to pose a threat to diverse populations in LA, displacing longtime residents, eroding cultural heritage, and exacerbating economic disparities. These changes alter the physical landscape, disrupt social networks, and challenge the preservation of cultural identity. Understanding these dynamics is crucial in appreciating the power and importance of narrative art in public spaces. In Baca's study for Chavez Ravine and the division of the barrios, we see a story of gentrification and the fallout of urban planning and development initiatives that adversely impact communities of color and which have shaped the history and people of LA. On the right, we see a woman, arms defiantly stretched to the sky, being taken away from Chavez Ravine by a uniformed officer. Dodger Stadium hovers overhead like a descending spaceship about to land atop the homes on the hill, with lights shining down on the community and its people, akin to the searchlights of today's police helicopters surveilling the city's working-class neighborhoods. The figures of the woman and the officer wrapped in apparent conflict are reminiscent of the photographs of Chavez Ravine resident Aurora Vargas being forcibly removed from her home by the LA County Sheriff's Department on May 8, 1959. Those historic images show Vargas being lifted and pulled by officers who carry her down the stairs to her home, pushing, pulling, and detaining her as she yells in opposition. On the left side of the image, we see a family torn apart, the freeway wrapped around parents and children, enveloping and splitting them as they extend their hands, reaching toward each other. The family is fractured, their ties cut by the construction of LA's freeways, which were laid across black and brown neighborhoods in the 1950s and 1960s, as the city transitioned to the system of expressways and car culture that we know today. Laid on top of Black, Latinx, and immigrant neighborhoods, the justification for the location of the freeway system intended to eliminate so-called urban blight, and the impact was the disenfranchisement and splintering of the communities, as well as the physical separation and socioeconomic isolation of areas such as Boyle Heights and East LA from the rest of the city. Now, at the Lucas Museum, we often say that we hope people will find stories that speak to them and their lives within the museum's walls. This image resonates deeply with me on a familial level. Since the early 1900s, my family has roots in Little Mexico Village, a barrio in Dallas, Texas. Due to Jim Crow laws, Mexican residents and immigrants were confined to certain areas, and Little Mexico became a vibrant community with churches, schools, businesses, and restaurants. My great-grandfather built a simple adobe home there by hand, later replaced by a wooden shotgun-style house. My grandfather worked as a cook downtown, and my grandmother cared for her own family, as well as Mexican and Native American foster children. In the 1960s, a major highway split the neighborhood, leading to its decline and the displacement of residents, including my extended family. My grandparents relocated to East Dallas, but gentrification in the 1990s forced my family out again as developers transitioned their block into townhomes and a microbrewery. Baca's image parallels the story of my own family, explaining a process of power, economics, and racialized policies that impact the lives of families across time. Now, Chavez Ravine and the Southern California Highway Master Plan is but one vignette, one set of stories of the Great Wall of Los Angeles. In other images, we see tales of LA's diverse communities unfold, displaying the events of the first half of the 20th century that established the social, political, and economic constructs within which the city's populations have developed. Some of it is celebratory, some mark the period's challenges and unrest. Taken as a whole, we see the richness of LA's culture on display with watershed moments that have transformed society. Baca tackles numerous subjects, including Native American assimilation, Japanese internment, the origins of the civil rights and gay rights movements, the Red Scare and McCarthyism, white flight and the development of suburbia, and the transition of women out of the World War II workforce. She addresses complex issues that continue today, including gentrification, gerrymandering, and voter suppression. By highlighting events like the Chinese Massacre of 1871, the Zoot Suit riots of 1943, and the experiences of farm workers under the Bracero program, Baca's work provides a space for cultural plurality and public discourse. The mural serves as a historical document and a public monument, celebrating the resilience and contributions of diverse peoples. Her longstanding plan to further develop the mural is now realized through support from entities such as the Mellon Foundation. Baca and a team of artists are using the galleries at LACMA as a studio, painting new chapters to later install these panels in situ at the mural site. The mural and its important stories continue to unfold. Muralism, as practiced by Baca, is inherently collaborative and community-based. Through her work on the mural and with the Social Public and Art Resource Center, known as SPARC, Baca has developed methodologies for involving community stakeholders in creating murals, fostering a sense of ownership and pride among participants, while ensuring the narratives depicted represent the community's experiences and values. Founded during the Chicano and women's movements of the 1970s, SPARC continues to advocate for cultural equity and artistic expression. Baca's work with SPARC has helped establish Los Angeles as a hub for public art and narrative storytelling, contributing to the city's identity as a center for cultural innovation. Baca's collaborative practice extends beyond the creation of art to include advocacy, education, and the preservation of cultural heritage. SPARC's historic programs, such as the Neighborhood Pride Mural Program and the Digital Mural Lab, exemplify this holistic approach, bringing art directly to communities and creating spaces for public engagement. However, Baca's contributions to the art world extend beyond her murals. She's influenced generations of artists and community leaders as an educator, mentor, and advocate. Her work with SPARC has set a standard for social practice in contemporary art. Narrative art, like those narrative murals created by Baca, are critical public monuments that elevate the stories of unsung heroes and marginalized communities. By depicting historical events and cultural narratives, these murals provide a visual record of collective experience that is accessible to all. The Lucas Museum of Narrative Art aims to showcase the power of visual storytelling in shaping and reflecting society. Through its collection and exhibitions, the museum will highlight the importance of narrative art in engaging with these cultural and historic narratives and stories. Judith F. Baca's The Great Wall of Los Angeles is a powerful example of how murals can convey complex societal histories and foster a sense of community and shared identity. By exploring the intersections of art, culture, and social change, the Lucas Museum seeks to create a platform for dialogue and reflection. We look forward to the museum's opening, and we remember the transformative power of art in shaping our understanding of the world and our place within it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pilar, and particularly for, I think, drawing out the political and social context for narrative imagery. We are going to transition to our Q&A now, as my colleagues are coming up to set up some chairs on the stage. I invite the participants to join me up here for a Q&A. Are there any questions right off the bat? Anyone urgent to ask anything? Yes, I can see one question right there on the right. Lisa, yes.
Excuse me. I'm interested in the stories being told left to right or right to left. In the fellow with the blowgun, that seems to be a story told from right to left, if we buy into your idea that it is a story and not two hunters. Whereas, like Judith Baca's mural goes left to right. And I'm wondering if that is a reflection of the cultures and how their own language developed, or why it is that some things go left to right and other things go right to left, and if in Japanese murals they go down and up.
Well, I can at least start that from the perspective of comics, at least. Within our 1030 comics corpus, we do find a relationship between the orientation of the writing systems and the orientation of the comics, the left-right versus right-to-left. And Asian scripts like Japanese, Chinese, as well as Arabic and Hebrew scripts are read right to left. And you do find a higher proportion of comics then that are using that. But because of the cultural origins of manga, coming from Japan originally, you also find just that manga in general are done right to left, regardless of the writing systems of the places, because that's the convention for that particular system. In another corpus, though, we also find that there's more verticality. Even though manga, for example, is read more right to left than top to bottom, Japanese and Chinese scripts are right to left, but they're also primarily top to bottom in columns. And you do find more embedded columns within those layouts as well, even though they are predominantly right to left. So there seems to be some influence on the directionality of the visual sequencing related to the writing systems. Now, you can probably speak better about the glyph directions than in relationship to the Maya, because, as I said before, it's rotated, right? So in that regard, it's somewhat right to left, but it's also rotational, right?
So the texts run, of course, left to right, but the actual images themselves are configured hierarchically, so that typically everything flows to the figure on the right, because if they're ensconced on a throne, they would be of the highest station, and there would be other people coming to greet them. So in progressive, almost hierarchical irradiation, the further you get from that focal figure, the less important you are. And so it's a different sort of arrangement. I might have a different interpretation, probably, of the vase that's in the display over here. I don't remember what Jesper and Søren said in their paper, but frankly, I think they're probably two different figures because they have different headdresses, which would indicate probably distinct identities. There is, within Maya tradition, a very profoundly entrenched system of dyadic figures, that is, of twinning, something you see throughout the Americas, as a matter of fact. And I think you're looking there probably at twins. And so it is fascinating that they're held constant in some ways, but there are enough idiosyncratic, or as you would put it, Mark, incongruities between the two images, which would, to me, signal that they're different characters. That particular pod is fascinating because it is almost a perfect fusion of hieroglyphs and imagery in a way that's really quite intriguing to me, because the pellet that's being shot out by the blowgunners is actually the glyph for seed. It's literally a glyphic sign, and so it's not just a pellet as you might see it, as the eye might see it, but they're going that extra mile, so to speak, to tell you it is a particular kind of pellet. And so they often use the hieroglyphs to kind of hyperspecify things. And so the way the images show action often are about who is of relative social importance, who is the most important in the scene, because I think these are almost like Southeast Asia in their intense focus on hierarchy and on social inequality as being the default. That's the way the world should be, and that seems to be what they tend to channel in their imagery.
May I follow up on that with a question to you then?
Sure.
In that social hierarchy, is there a directionality associated with it? So are the more hierarchic on the right, for example?
Absolutely they are. So the figures over the right are the most important, and then you have figures arranged around them according to their relative importance. And you'll see that in a number of the pots here in the exhibit, which are really quite interesting. Now, I think as you were pointing out, Mark, what's fascinating is to look at the default, and then as a specialist, you look for the incongruity, you look for the violation of the norm, of the convention. And so frequently, or in some cases, you'll see figures moving in the wrong direction. They seem to be not going in that particular order. And that probably has to do with a specific narrative of leaving and return. And they're part of bigger stories here that go, as I said, off camera. And there's so much that's off camera in Maya imagery, and I imagine in the other traditions we're looking at that are all important in trying to figure out what they're showing or attempting to depict.
Yeah, and if I could just, for Greek narrative, primarily left to right. But one side of a vessel might go right to left and the other side go left to right because the protagonist is changed. So, a lot of it has to do with the shape of the vase and the stage of the story. If there are different stages of the story on different sides, the reverse might show a different direction there. I think the Greeks could be quite flexible about that. I mean, predominantly it's left to right, but and even about writing, it's primarily left to right. But you saw images of two warriors bending over a board, and they're actually playing a game. And in the original version of that by Ezekias, there are actually words coming out of their mouths. One is calling Tris, that's Ajax, and then Achilles is calling Tessera. So both words begin with T, but if you look at the way it's drawn, written out of their mouths, T is the first word. So one word is spelled backwards and the other word is spelled forwards because, of course, T would be the first sound that would come out of their mouths, and then the other letters follow in place. So primarily left to right, but not rigidly.
Just to finish, like in the case of the Moche organization of the images, you have seen maybe the flat images, but we have to consider that they're always placed on the round pieces. And usually you have two different kind of actions. Maybe they are organized in a sequence, but it doesn't matter which way you turn it. You have the two episodes in opposite positions of the vessel. Usually, when you have interactions of two actors, you can see probably the higher position, let's say, to the left, maybe some offerings. You can see the direction of the action taking place, usually from the right to the left, but you have so many organization in duality in the vessels, and also when you see spirals, you have two spirals, one spiral going up, the other spiral going down. So it's like not really specific direction for the reading, at least until now.
And I'll just note on the Baca mural, it is, a sequential narrative beginning with prehistory and then kind of skipping ahead to the 20th century and doing panels by decade. Now they're going to continue the mural, and it's my understanding that it is going to face in the opposite direction. So then you may have a different orientation when you're looking at the second half of the 20th century, because you'll be able to view it in relationship to other moments in time, which I think is going to be very interesting to see how these different histories can relate and speak to each other.
I mean, one fascinating thing that's really not been studied in my own subject is probably addressing what might be in my tabulation about 10 to 15 objects made by lefties or people that were ambidextrous. And they have a very different way of configuring space. And so that would suggest strongly that this kind of spatial hierarchy I was talking about before could switch around in these other instances. And these are fascinating objects, and they occur throughout the gamut of the classic Maya period that I focus on, but to date not studied by anyone as a corpus or as a group.
Mary?
Thank you so much for these extremely interesting and provocative talks and leading to this conversation. As Pilar was speaking, I was thinking about this question of frontality and how this kind of captures and makes the eye stop so that the narrative seems to stop progressing. And this then put me in mind of some of the things that happen on Maya pots, where often frontality is like a humiliating thing you don't want to have happen to you. But I wondered if each one of you could talk a little bit about how there's narrative in motion, and then how frontality may stop, highlight, take us into a different time, or perhaps even with something like Moche, where the fully three-dimensional figures pop right out and then seem to put everything else into a subsidiary time frame.
Mm-hmm. I could say something just to begin, since the context of those images is so different than many of the other things we're talking about today. But I certainly think about all of the critical components within Baca's mural as being equally relevant, but you're looking at kind of, certain figures that are placed very large and with this very dynamic geometry to really force your attention, force your perspective. She did study in Mexico at Siqueiros's taller, so she did learn that punto system, which forces you to kind of lay out the whole overarching structure of the image, so that when it's to scale as large as it is, these images don't fall flat. So that does bring you to those very frontal figures, but at the same time, and if you have the opportunity to go see her painting in situ in the galleries at LACMA, it's really incredible. There's so much content that is in the background that's equally significant, and she may be creating specific portraits of individuals who have been part of different social movements and telling their stories on a macro and a micro level. So in her case, there's a lot of kind of push-pull between what the overarching story of any one of the decade panels might be, and then the narratives that might be specific to individuals that are embedded, that you're meant to look at on a deeper level, and that are going to reveal themselves the more you look at the image.
And as Mary and of course many other Mayanists have looked at this very arresting attribute that you see of breaking the fourth wall. It's very Brechtian as a way of directly and emotionally involving the viewer. And of course, as we know, as Mayanists, many of those who are breaking the fourth wall, that is looking out as we're doing right now, tend to be people in positions of high humiliation or even slightly buffoonish. They might be captives. Or foreigners who are looking out. And so it's obviously, again, a playing with the default and breaking it, fracturing it. And it must have had some sort of emotional wallop when they included it. But also it has to do with I think a bigger issue and challenge in looking at these pots with stories, which is what is the role of the viewer, and when they break the fourth wall like this, you're directly implicated in that world of experience. You're brought into the scene as opposed to just being a kind of dispassionate or distant observer. One of the things that fascinates me about the speech scrolls that you were referring to, and that I've done a study of along with other scholars, is the speech act, when it's specified or highlighted in these kinds of images, are never of the current time. They're always from some distant past or from involving people that died 2 generations ago. And that is, to me, so fascinating about the Maya case, which is what would seem to be viscerally present, of hearing something, is in fact completely unknowable because it took place at such a distant time.
I would probably add a little bit, like, we are able today to see all of these objects and a lot of people looking at them, but the question would be, like, how many people would have looked at them in the past? Because some of them we know were just made and then buried, no? So they were not meant to be even seen, but maybe probably just by the maker and at some intermediary or the ritual use in that specific event, and then meant to be an active body of clay that would be kind of a magical object, no? That would create something or make something or allow for the path of the death to the other world. So these things happening in this kind of time, in the threshold between life and death, because most of these objects have this final funerary use, no? So what today it creates on us when we observe them, and how we can kind of react not only in cognition, with the knowledge, but also emotionally because of the kind of images, then the question is, like, were they exposed like that in the past, or just like meant to carry that energy or that message into that other world that somebody else, no, other actors would be finally the ones to decipher or to read it or to be activated by that message, no?
Thank you for the question, Mary. And I've been trying to run through all the frontal heads that I can think of. And there's actually a couple different aspects to it. So one, in terms of a narrative going on, I would say the most common version is when you have a satyr or a Maenad in a Dionysiac scene. They're dancing, they're cavorting, and one of the figures will turn their head out frontal. Often a satyr, in engaging with the viewer. But then thinking about that, if it's on a drinking cup, when you're holding a drinking cup by the stem, the drinker can't really see the scenery on the exterior. The scene that the drinker sees is on the interior of the cup when you pull the cup up to your face. The frontal head is actually for all of the other viewers in the room, because the cup is being used in a symposium with other guests there. So the frontal face doesn't confront the holder of the cup, but confronts the other viewers in the room. What you often find on the inside of a cup is a Gorgon's mask staring at you. And maybe that's a warning, or maybe it's an apotropaic device, but it's a very frequent kind of image on the inside, but that would only be seen by the drinker drinking. And it would be interesting to think the wine comes down, the wine covers the face, but when you drink, the wine comes down, the face is revealed, and then it is concealed again, because if you just keep holding the cup, it'll spill all over yourself, and then you'll be humiliated. The other thing is, there was a couple of examples of eye cups that I showed, and the one in Melusa's cup that's up in the exhibit, and that's a frontal face. Sometimes they even have a nose right on the central axis, just drawn in outline. So this cup has a kind of frontality. It's looking at you. And then there are all the narrative scenes either between the eyes or under the handles. And that too has been kind of it was thought that, okay, when you drink, and especially if these are on cups, when you drink, you can't see what's going on, so they're kind of a mask that you have eyes that look out. But the Etruscans didn't drink that way. And Jeremy Bundrick has proposed that actually they're for tombs and they're apotropaic devices. They watch over the deceased. They're poised on tops of vessels so that they continue to watch. So the mask theory in her mind doesn't work for the Italic cultures that would have used them. So those are some of but it's an unusual phenomenon, and it's arresting when you see it. There's a great scene on the Françoises, the great procession to the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, and there's Dionysus with the amphora looking out. But that draws your attention to that amphora, which eventually will become the ash container for Achilles, who's the son of Peleus and Thetis. So few cases like that it really, in a way, is kind of a proleptic reference in the narrative.
And then the other, I suppose, in Greek art, the other setting for frontal faces is dead figures, or figures who are drunk. They're kind of a changing of states, essentially. And that, in the Greek word apostrophe, literally means turning away. And so your point about that sort of rupture, it's that sort of intentionality of sort of breaking up the scene and demonstrating that these figures are somehow different. The other vase in the show, the East Greek plate with the battle between Hector and Menelaus over Euphorbus, has these two eyes that the painter has added to the scene. There is this very, and it's sort of interesting, I don't know for other cultures, but the sort of self-consciousness of some of these painters, that they are depicting stories and representing eyes. And we've spoken a lot about storytelling, but there is this very, the painters have this consciousness of making images, which I imagine happens. I mean, one thing to say in graphic novels or comic books, where there's little vignettes when they're breaking the fourth wall and so on. So these are presumably continuous across many different.
Yeah, so the things that come to mind for me is a couple of things. First, it's worth remembering that the way in which figures are represented are patterns that are conventionalized and internalized by the people who create them. And you see a lot of side-facing patterns throughout much of historical representations. Both, I think, because they play functional roles, i.e. you can allow figures to face each other, you can show directionality of movement, things like that. And it also allows for distinguishing features of those faces that are harder when figures are facing to the front. You also need to then, front-facing figures, you need to then give it a sense of depth to be able to understand that what's going on in a front-facing figure. Speaking to the part about more contemporary use of that in comics, one thing that is worth noting is I talked about this varying levels of complexity of representations of how much information is involved in each panel. And what you see there is the use of, say, a panel as a window. That is, you're varying how much a representation is being shown as a whole. And you don't see that quite as much in the other examples that we saw. If I don't want to speak out of turn, but you generally see whole figures at once rather than portions of figures. And that aspect of framing is actually fairly important for when you look at things like, as we talk about fourth wall breaking and the engagement of a participant of the narrative with the viewer, with things that we nowadays call things like point of view shots or things like that. In our work, we've identified a range of, say, ways that the content of a narrative directly engages with the reader. Some of them are implicit, like a figure facing the viewer, which gives an implicit sense that the viewer is part of an exchange with the element that's within the narrative. Another of those is, though, showing you what a element in the narrative sees, such as a subjective viewpoint. In the case of those subjective viewpoints, you're not seeing necessarily a figure looking at you, although you might, but you're seeing through the eyes of another figure in those cases. And what we see is actually, statistically,
The more refined viewpoints, like the close-up sorts of shots or the environmental shots, have a much higher proportion of subjective viewpoints used in them than full scenes or single character panels. So that is to say that when you are focusing in on information, you are also potentially trying to simulate a reader's attention on that scene as if you are in the scene itself looking at it. It's a little bit different than the front-facingness of figures, but it's to some degree functionally similar in that it's trying to draw you into the narrative or pop something that's unexpected or different out of the representation that you're used to in order to draw focus to it.
Shelby, do we have anything on any questions on Zoom?
There are.
Oh, wow.
One question is about whether there are visual universals as there are linguistic universals. For example, orientation of figures with writing or size of figure correlated to importance, things like that.
So from our work, I can say there are some of that. So I would not say universal is the directionality part because that's relative to an additional system like writing rather than a property of the visuals unto themselves, although that directionality might be part of the systems themselves or become part of the system, the graphic systems. The size issue, you do see persisting throughout many graphic systems, if not all. I think other people.
The size?
Yeah, so like importance being tied to size. So larger things being more important than
Hierarchical.
hierarchical, yeah. A mapping of that. You certainly see that in contemporary works as well. The universals that we typically talk about in linguistics are more at a subtle level. So one of them that I did not put in the slides is I talked about the amount of information per panel, but you can cut that up in a different way by saying just simply how many characters are there per panel in general. So is there 1 character per panel, 2 characters, 3 characters, 4 characters, et cetera. And you do see the same sort of variance across systems. So manga use fewer characters than the more, say, superhero or cartoony systems. However, if you look at the frequencies of panels that have different amounts of characters in them, that is, how many panels are there with 1 character? How many panels with 2 characters, 3 characters, 4 characters? What you see is what's called a Zipfian distribution or a decaying function. And this comes directly from linguistics. So in linguistics, there's a relationship between the length of a word and its frequency within a language. So shorter words occur more often than longer words, no matter what language it is. And this does seem to be a statistically universal. It persists in all languages. And it's a decaying function because it's like, the shorter words, then slightly longer, so it's like decaying as it goes down like a waterfall. So if you look at the panel frequencies, if 1 character per panel, 2 characters per panel, 3 characters in the frequency, it has that exact same decaying function to it. So panels that have fewer characters occur more often than those with more characters. If you look at that statistically, it in fact doesn't vary at all by culture, by style, by anything. It's just this persisting universal trend. So even though those systems are having different distributions of how many characters are in panels in systematic ways that distinguish them, if you look at this underlying trait, they actually are universally the same. So in that regard, there does seem to be a universal that's both consistent with across visual languages and consistent with the lexicons of spoken languages too.
A particular interest of mine are hieroglyphic systems, of which there are very few in world history. And typically what you'll find, almost without exception, is that reading order is, and the orientation of the hieroglyphs, particularly if they have faces or they have profiles, is absolutely and always contingent on reading direction. So that if you're going from, let's say, left to right, all the glyphs with noses and mouths, they're going to be facing that direction. So I've said this several times in a number of publications, but there's almost inherently a kind of socialization or a social interaction that goes on in terms of that reading order as your eye scans it. and the way that the hieroglyphs will then face in that direction. Now, this is violated in a couple of cases in ancient Egyptian. So that if you go into, let's say, Old Kingdom or Middle Kingdom tombs, you'll see that glyphs, the reading order sometimes shifts, but it's because the bodies nearby have also shifted. And so there's absolutely a kind of profound connection there between reading order, reading direction, and the way that the bodies are disposed in space. And that's something that seems to be pretty much invariant.
I have, can you hear me?
Yep.
Is it working? I have always been so impressed with the Mayan graphics and the fine line work and the density and the glyphs. Were only the elite able to read those graphics, or did everybody understand them? And can you say something about the use of profile, which is so prevalent with all these graphics?
Yeah, so there have been recent studies of these matters in some other hieroglyphic systems in which there are sometimes greater degrees of frontality, or you might have what are called dorsal views, or kind of looking down on something. This is a matter of cross-cultural difference, so that among the Maya, you don't have downward views of things. It doesn't exist. It's not like an Egyptian system. Instead, it's always what we call sagittal. It's always at the side. In terms of the broader question, which is unfortunately difficult to resolve satisfactorily, would be the matter of literacy rates in these societies. And I've always seen this since I began dabbling in this subject some years ago. I've seen this in terms of a gradient, in that one of the virtues primarily of a hieroglyphic system is that it's always going to be some degree accessible to anyone that's conversant in those traditions of graphic displays. You can recognize a hand or a face or a body. That is always there to tantalizing extent in hieroglyphic systems. The dirty little secret, or the cheeky almost mischief of hieroglyphic systems, is they almost coax you into thinking you can understand what's going on by approaching them from that iconographic perspective. And then they'll just cut you off ruthlessly, because you're never going to go beyond that. It takes that much extra degree of comprehension or understanding to figure out actually what they're saying. And so it takes you close, and then it pushes you away. It is, at least with Maya hieroglyphs, it's, I think, always playing around with that degree of exclusivity, of showing what's available before you and then shutting that door slam shut in your face. So you can't get at it unless you've done extensive study. And it's a weird degree of, you might say, ambivalence that's embedded within the use of that writing system.
I wanted to ask, one of the things that is kind of striking about the exhibit is that there's such variation in the sizes of the vessels among the three cultures. So the very big wine mixing jars, the very small moche pieces that are just stuffed with imagery. And I wanted to ask about the relationship between size and narrative, not in the sense of kind of a hierarchy of importance, but sort of whether there's a different form of storytelling that happens with a very small vessel, like a perfume bottle, and a wine mixing jar, or a big vessel that makes noise when you drink from it, and a small cup that's just for one person. How actual size of the vessel relates to the narrative and the storytelling that happens on it.
Well, I could take a stab at that to start. It's a really interesting question. The interesting answer to that is if you look at some of those Corinthian vessels that are this big, they're miniature, but some of the details, like the warriors fighting, they're actually fighting in rows or in phalanxes, which is actually how they fought. And so in minute detail, they're actually showing a very complicated arrangement of figures in space, whereas if you look at Athenian pottery, they rarely fight in phalanxes. It's man-to-man warriors fighting each other, when in reality there would have been many men in a row fighting each other like that. So in a way, the larger Athenian narratives are more simplified than the tiny little Corinthian narratives there. I think size, one thing that does happen is the early narratives in Athens tend to be more miniature. They divide the vase into multiple friezes, so you have tinier figures. And what begins to happen by the mid-6th century is they start focusing on one panel. and making the figures bigger, more monumental, but therefore having to simplify because you don't have the width if you make the panel larger. Some vases, though, because of their structure, they have two parts. There's a neck, and you can put a scene there, and there's the belly, and you can put a scene there. But other than the difference of the length of the field, the bigger the picture, the squarer the picture, so it limits it. But if you have a long frieze, then you'll get more multiple characters. But I don't think the complexity of the narrative changes much with that. But you're right, some of these, there's a large crater, there's a large crater up in the third room of the exhibit, which has, figures that are this big. And when you get to that stage, you start getting more emotional complexity rather than just action. You're drawing figures that have expression, especially in the middle of the 5th century and later. And so I think there's more of a psychological element rather than just, brute force warrior against warrior there. And you can begin to see some of that in 5th century and 4th century art, but it doesn't, I don't know that it directly relates to the size of the vase. They can be quite variant, but the big vases, some of them are getting close to monumental painting on walls in terms of the scale of the figures, which is another thing that develops in the 5th century, is monumental wall painting, none of which survives, of course, but...
I mean, it's a great question, Sarah, and to me it might have potentially, with the Maya data I know a little better, would be have to do with two different dimensions, one of which would be gender, and the other would be vessel use. One of the things you'll notice when you go over to room number 1 is that there's an exquisite little Maya cylinder. It's also the only vessel in that collection over there that's owned by a woman. And you can see this in the classic period, that the most exquisite vessels tend to be owned by women. And it's just you can draw whatever inference you want from that. Now, in terms of function, I've long seen those big tamale bowls as essentially objects of furniture. And they are typically also the noisy pots. That is, they've got the little clay balls. When you lift them, they start making rattling noises. They're almost squeaking. Don't move me. Don't even, or I'm going to be making a racket. And they are the noisy ones. The others don't seem to have that kind of capacity. When they're that large, there's a lot of food being served. And some of the vessels or big tamale bowls that excavated at Piedras Negras many years ago, they would have served the multitude. And similarly, the really big Maya cylinders, and size really does matter in this instance, are probably used, as I mentioned before to some of our colleagues here when we went through the collection, used for spuming. And as we know, they didn't have the batidor, as they do in Mexico, for spuming chocolate, but rather they would pour it back and forth, and that would eventually get you that rich head of spume that they seem to enjoy. And so to me, it's what goes into it. It has to do with the dimension, not so much a narrative, but what are they used for ultimately, which is to serve food and drink.
In the case of the moche, here also at the exhibition, you basically have two kinds of vessels, no? The open big vessels that basically have kind of this also noisy properties because they are rattles, and they are shown also in the iconography as vessels used in some events or rituals or ceremonies of interaction, of healing, of not treating bodies or transition between life and death. So they might have been moved, filled with water, and they have some complex scenes, all of which relate to things that have to do with the passage. Combats or weaving for the attire of the ancestor, or the one that I showed, the voyage of the hero. You have these kind of scenes there. But all the other ones, like the stirrup spout bottles, the differences have to do with two times. Like in early moche, you don't have really large scenes or complex scenes. You have basically either personage on both sides, or maybe one interaction between one personage and the other. The more narrative it becomes after, in the late moche period. And then you can see the differences between substyles in different regions, and you have this substyle that is really impressive with these very little vessels that are full of a lot of episodes, either in spiral shape or in 4 or 5 different panels, complex panels with various personages, but that's very, in a specific place. So I think, it has to do with the development of specific ways of developing this narrative art, which was not developed in all the Moche territory at the same degree, let's say.
And at the risk of speaking too much, which maybe is the case this afternoon, I would also say that I don't know of a single bowl that has dynastic content. That is, it's always about mythic beings, it's about maze gods, or it's the great cosmic plate that's now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, or it's the one on display over here with a nice jaguar pelage painting around it. But what you have inside are these primordial fish, this fish couple. And then in the middle is the maze god who's sort of emerging. But that seems to be categorical. And it's when you get into the cylinders that they seem narratively to get much more involved in dynastic discourse. And that is simply not present in these big, whopping tamale bowls.
I'm going to suggest we take the conversation and enjoy it over a cup of tea or coffee or tejete. I don't think the drinking vessels we have are decorated outside, but I hope we've provided you with enough material for this conversation to continue. Thank you all for joining us today. Please join me in thanking our spectacular speakers.